Today, my guest is my good friend Christian John, and we really talked about so many different things. It was awesome. We talked about Mark Vicente's new documentary, The Narcissist Playbook. We talked about some of the things that we think are issues in the narcissistic abuse space. We talked about narcissistic parents. We talked about some of the unique struggles that people with autism who have narcissistic parents struggle with. We talked about why it seems like so many narcissists choose autistic people as romantic partners. We talked about some of our issues with self-aware narcissists. We talked about estranged parents and how they talk about it online. We talked about how learning about narcissism is really only the first step in healing. We have to also try to improve ourselves. And we even talked about some of the struggles that social media content creators experience. And with that, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Christian as much as I did. Christian, how are you today, sir?
Jared, I'm doing well. It's nice to see you again.
Always good to be seen and always good to see you too. We always have a great chat together and we'd always talk a long time before we even press play.
Yeah,
But I love it though. I think
yeah, me
this,
too. Me too.
the conversation just can go on and on.
Yeah, yeah.
But we both did see The Narcissist Playbook
hmm
by Mark
hmm
Vicente.
hmm
Curious, what were your thoughts on that documentary?
Overall, I thought it was a pretty successful documentary. Actually, my degree includes film criticism, so here we go. It's something I'm actually qualified for. As a documentary, kind of creating a premise, feeding that premise, exploring that premise. I thought it was wildly successful. I think for people that are new to the topic, it's a nice condensed tool to kind of get into a deeper understanding of narcissistic abuse. I mean, I have some complaints about it, but overall, I was genuinely impressed. I was a little hesitant when I heard of the participation of some of the so-called self-aware narcissists, because I'm always kind of questioning whether platforming these people and making them famous for being narcissists helps anybody, including themselves. But I thought it was even-handed. I thought, I thought like the kind of survivor testimonies mixed with the more academic exploration of it. They had a nice collection of experts, let's call them, as well as survivors. It's heavy on the kind of romantic relationship dynamic, which, as more of an advocate for the children of narcissists, is always a little bit disappointing. That I'd like to see a little bit more time spent on exploring what it means to be raised by a narcissist. But I understand, the audience online and in reality for narcissistic content does skew towards the romantic relationship angle. And so, again, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I didn't know what to think going into it.
Right. I think they did a good job. And I think what happens is people find out usually about narcissism because of a romantic relationship.
hmm
So it is
hmm
often the
Yeah.
first step. But then once they peel back that layer of the onion, often the next step is realizing, oh, wait a minute. I
hmm
actually had a narcissistic parent, or there's
hmm
narcissism all throughout my family
hmm
tree. And I
hmm
call it the sixth sense moment. But I see that
I
happen a
like
lot.
that. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's true. I mean, that's the, for me, it was the opposite. Was having a therapist identify my dad as a narcissist, giving me trapped in the mirror and kind of sending me off on this special interest, let's call it, to kind of figure these things out. But I think you're absolutely right that a lot of people's initiation into the world of narcissism comes from a toxic relationship.
Right.
Um,
And it was good also that they had a male victim in there too. You don't
yeah,
hear
yeah.
that as much out there, but there are certainly female narcissists in the world, and they did highlight that. I was happy about that too.
I love to see that. I think with the discussion online, you'd sometimes come away with the impression that there are no female narcissists, that it's so heavily gendered and focused on men. But I would suspect that it's about an equal thing. It's just that I think it presents a little differently in women. I think of narcissism a lot through the lens of how people get their needs met. And so, how a person gets their needs met in our culture can be different based on gender. Now, obviously, that's changing, but I think the traits. This is a generalization, and they obviously overlap. But I think sometimes they present differently in the different genders.
I think by far women will present more covertly a
Mhm,
lot of times.
mhm,
And that's not to say there can't be grandiose women. There can be.
mhm,
And
mhm,
that's not to say there's not covert men. Of course there can be. But I
mhm,
think if you had to break it down, okay, what's the percentage of women who are covert
mhm.
versus grandiose? I wouldn't be surprised to see a 70-30, 75-25 split.
Right, right. And I always say narcissism kind of hides in cultural norms and standards. And so, when we look at our kind of patriarchal culture, men weaponizing grandiosity versus women, and this is a difficult topic, versus women weaponizing victimhood, which
Mm.
is what a lot of covert narcissists do, would make sense in how you can operate within this specific culture and kind of manipulate and get your needs met.
And you see, I do think, and we've talked about this before, but I do think there's a lot of covert types. They gravitate towards the healing spaces. They gravitate towards
There's no
spirituality.
question.
And
Yeah.
I would not be surprised one bit if there's covert narcissists acting like they're victims of narcissistic abuse out there, creating about it. And then not even just this space, but
Right.
other spaces as well. And that gets
Right.
really tricky though,
It
because
does.
can a covert narcissist be a victim of abuse? Yeah, I think they can,
Anybody can.
but that doesn't also mean they're not a
Right.
covert
I don't think
narcissist
these things
themselves.
are like just because you're a victim doesn't mean you can't be an abuser. But I do think like covert narcissists, like when we think of grandiosity, there can be grandiosity in victimhood, right? And so I think 100% there's a lot of covert narcissism in the kind of narcissistic abuse recovery space. I know from my dad and growing up in the new age kind of spiritual community, there's a lot of narcissism there too. The covert stuff, I think what makes it covert is they show up in places where you wouldn't expect them. And the grandiosity can be in performative altruism, and then you get to know them and you see that there's nothing, it's all mask, right?
Mm.
It's all how they're being perceived. And again, this is a kind of like, I almost feel like guilty talking about the weaponization of victimhood, for instance, because it leads to kind of accusations of victim blaming or these things that victimhood is a kind of protected sacred status, but it's also exploited. I mean, it's. I'm thinking of Fight Club a little bit and the tourist, of how they're showing up at different support groups. Not saying that that character is a narcissist, but just that people show up in victim spaces and support systems for various types of reasons that are not always what we think they are.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to emphasize that we're not talking about everybody, right? This is not
Right,
everyone that's in
right,
this space
right,
or
right.
creators, but
At
there's
all.
a small percentage that they're getting the needs met that they want.
Yeah,
Like getting
yeah.
attention, admiration, narcissistic supply,
Mhm,
emphasizing victimhood.
mhm,
It fits what they would want. And I
mhm.
think, like we've mentioned with women, more often covert. And I think what happens a lot of times is when people say, oh, men are so much more likely to be the abuser, I think what they're emphasizing is just the physical
They,
violence
they
piece.
are. I think this is what makes the discussion on psychological abuse particularly hard for our culture is that it levels the playing field between the archetype of the abuser, right? And that we have a culture that has rightfully, kind of defined through the lens of physical abuse that the man is primarily the abuser in that context. But when it comes to psychological abuse, it's simply a more even playing field, and it's difficult. I mean, I honestly feel like weird talking about it in public because of the way that we have these protected spaces. But it's true. It's simply the truth that narcissists exploit cultural norms and cultural standards, right? They kind of hide in expected human behavior. They hide in protected spaces. They hide in masks of things you might not expect. And so to really get to the root of talking about it means having somewhat uncomfortable
Right.
conversations that kind of break away from generalized cultural norms.
I think it is true, right, that I think men more likely to end the life of their female partner than
Mhm,
females ending the life of their male partners.
mhm,
But that is true. But also, I think when it comes to the psychological, emotional, verbal, coercive control, I think you'll see a fair amount of women that are in
mhm,
control of their relationships. They're the one that has more
mhm.
power. They have a stronger sense
Yeah.
of belief in their own reality, and they can absolutely abuse men.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of times we reduce power dynamics to physicality or financial issues that seem to favor men, but there are other power dynamics like sex, for instance, that can be used in abusive ways. You know, that the power dynamics aren't always as simple as I think we make them out to be in relationships. You know, especially parental relationships. The mother is a singular figure in the life of a child that transcends the father in a lot of ways. We come out of our mother. We are part of our mother. And when that relationship goes wrong and there's an abusive mother, it's a specific type of wound that occurs that is, something that needs to be talked about.
Sure. And I was listening to you today talk about that video that I think you said is her name Codependency Kate, but she
Mhm.
sent you this video. Could you talk about that video?
Yeah, so she and this is just a critique on what she was saying. Not her herself, but she was talking about we should stop calling abusers narcissists, and that I think there's some truth to that. I think we should still call narcissists. I think the word narcissist has become wildly overused, especially in kind of abuse recovery communities that are non-specific, like domestic violence, for instance, and that everybody that commits acts of domestic violence isn't a narcissist. In fact, I find the conflation of those two issues to be somewhat problematic, because a lot of narcissistic abuse, as I understand it, and as I've experienced it, doesn't come with a physical component. And so it creates a kind of like hierarchy of, well, there was no physical component, so it must not have been that bad. When to me, like, the physical abuse isn't actually part of the narcissism, right? It's part of, I mean, it's part of how that person grew up environmentally. Narcissism wouldn't help, but I don't think it's a characteristic that we would call narcissistic abuse. And so I think the point she was making was real nuanced. She started talking about like narcissistic parents, and that parents aren't operating from a perspective of their mental health with their children. I couldn't disagree more. I think
Mm-hmm.
narcissistic abuse, as I define it, is strictly the products of what it is to be in a relationship with a pathological narcissist, right? That like there are aspects of narcissism, at least as I understand it, pathological narcissism, that lead to contextual abuse regardless of intent, right? That a narcissist, in my mind, cannot recognize the other person's perspective, right? They have to kind of, I call it the tyranny of perspective. They have to impose their reality on anybody they're in a relationship with compulsively and as a product of their disorder. And so to me, that's abuse. Like, if you can't recognize that I have my own thoughts and feelings, and every time I express them, you reflect back to me a reframing of how I'm feeling and how I'm experiencing reality based on your distorted understanding of that, and it happens nonstop over time, to me, that's abusive. But it takes an expansion of the definition of abuse. I mean, psychological abuse is still, I think, a murky topic. Like, we can understand like berating and we can understand gaslighting, but when it comes to parents specifically, what is a child entitled to in their sense of self, in their own reality? Like, what is the child entitled to in sharing spaces with their adult, with their parents? I mean, we live in a world where authoritarian parenting has been the norm within Western culture for a long time. And so, to me, like, where she kind of like lost me a little bit was she seemed to be defining narcissism and defining abuse in very narrow like definitions that I think didn't didn't really didn't really do it for me. But again, I think it's an interesting question. I tend to try to not um I don't know. None of us know everything. These are kind of murky questions, and so it's all a healthy conversation. Disagreements move conversations forward. And I didn't. I think the point I liked was that like the word is overused, right? And it's not a catch-all for abuser, right? Like I do believe all narcissists are abusers, but I do not believe that all abusers are narcissists. But it's in that denial of the other person's humanity and the other person's perspective that I find the abuse. And
Yeah.
some people may not characterize that as abuse, and that's okay for them.
I do agree. I think the traits of narcissism, someone that has a narcissistic operating system, it's going to show up as abusive. It's like I would
Mhm.
tell people, show me the narcissist that's not
Right,
abusive.
right.
Which brings me to the next question. What would you say is the difference between a narcissistically abusive relationship and an abusive relationship? I've been wondering about this myself, but what do you think?
Well, see, I think the difference hinges in malleability or kind of like flexibility of behaviors, right? That I think the narcissist is trapped in their own perspective. And when we actually look at the individual components of the abuse as we know them, we can see that dynamic present in all of them, that they are seeking to impose their version of reality, which is not tethered to narrative consistency. It's tethered to them being in control. Right. And so we can see, to me, all of the aspects of narcissistic abuse as we've kind of defined it in pop psychology as relating to that. And so to me it's about does the person have a range of behaviors, or are they trapped in this one fixed behavior? And now people will point to like the fact that narcissists will behave differently to different people in public, but I still don't think that's evidence of the type of flexibility that I'm talking about. It's because they will adapt their behavior based on the nature of the relationship with the person they're interacting with. And so the fact that they're not going out to a restaurant and abusing the waitress every time doesn't actually speak to their ability to control their behavior within intimate relationships, be it a parental or romantic.
I think part of that is also they'll have different needs in
Yeah,
different situations, right? They'll get
precisely. Yeah,
supply in different
yeah,
ways from different people. And I do think their image orientedness, they
yeah,
know in family dynamics, for example, they'll know, okay, I can't mistreat this person because that could blow up in my face and my
mhm,
image. I do see that happening. Now, granted, give them a long enough time with them,
mhm.
they'll present themselves. I
Yeah,
think they're
yeah,
not going to be able to
yeah,
hide themselves completely, but in smaller doses, I
yeah.
think that's where it gets tricky for people.
I think that's to me that's the trickiness of it all, right? Especially as we're going out and having relationships and having moments where traits emerge is parsing like, is this like the emergence of a trait is this a red flag that means caution, or is this a red flag that means run the other way, right? And I don't think there's an easy answer to it. I mean, I think these things, for me, like part of the recovery from narcissistic parents is learning to trust our gut, but that means sometimes making mistakes, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes overcompensating, or sometimes not leaving when we see these red flags and remaining. But ultimately, my question would be, does it matter for us whether it's an abusive relationship or a narcissistic relationship? Does it matter for the person in that relationship when, whether it's abusive or narcissistic, they should leave? Right. I
Yeah,
mean,
I agree with that. Yeah, I mean that's why I don't emphasize the labels as much. I
yeah,
much more
yeah,
emphasize the behaviors because
yeah,
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're a narcissist, psychopath, or antisocial. Fill in the blank. If
yeah.
they're abusing you, disrespecting you, that's the part that matters.
Right, right, right. I mean, I think the labels are only as good as they provide a framework for setting our expectations and understanding the behaviors. I think with the children of narcissists, there's a specific way or a number of different options as to how the parental narcissism conditions the child. And so I think there is value in understanding those things. But ultimately, like, we can't really know for certain. If somebody comes to me and they want me to diagnose their partner, that's insane. Like,
Yeah,
I'm not qualified to diagnose anybody. And also, I've never met this person. But what we can do is kind of reverse engineer, without needing the diagnosis, how you've been affected. And in the kind of ways that people are affected, we can kind of see some of the truth emerge as to what they're dealing with, but staying away from the labels with of knowing for certain is a good idea, because I don't think ultimately, we were talking about this before, like, ultimately the healing is pivoting away from understanding the narcissist towards understanding ourselves, and that there's this pivot from what was done to us, as in understanding the narcissist, to what it means for us, as in understanding what it's done to us and how do we heal. I mean, I've been saying for a while that, like, to heal from a relationship with a narcissist isn't to heal the relationship with the narcissist, it's to heal the
yeah,
relationship with the self, right? With the way they've kind of injected themselves into our consciousness, and distorted. They create, I just said this in a video, they create this tug of war for reality in our own mind. And the healing is surrendering, basically, and planting ourselves in our own reality without having to contend with their kind of gaslit reality.
exactly right. I think, and that's something a lot of people struggle with because They struggle with thinking it can be victim blaming, but it's like, no,
Mhm.
you didn't know what you didn't know before.
Right.
And what I try to emphasize is healing is doing something different if the same situations were to happen again. It doesn't matter. And again, and some people had issues to work on before. I think some people
Mhm.
are dependent. I would not
Mhm.
codependent, but dependent.
Yeah.
They struggle with that. They're not good being on their own. Some people were people pleasers. Not everybody, but some of them. And but people get caught up on that. They say, how could you ever say that those people needed to work on themselves? It's a double whammy. And I would say, well, when you say these things matters. I'm not going to say that to someone that's just getting out of an abusive
Right. Right.
relationship. Like, oh
Right.
yeah,
Right. It's
you're
nuanced.
right. Like there's
It's nuanced.
stages of healing. And I
Yeah.
think down the line, in a stage two, after you've given them validation, after you say, yes, I understand, this is exactly what you went through, you were gaslit, blamed for everything, etc. And you let them learn about that for a while, because that is a very validating thing to put a name to what
It's
you were
crucial.
experiencing.
It's crucial, and here's why. Part of the reason narcissistic relationships linger so long in our minds is that our minds struggle to make sense of it. Our memory function and our minds think in a narrative structure. And so we don't know what happened. It spins
Right.
our head around like, what the fuck did we just deal with? And so that's why I call it a pivot, because we actually have to kind of make some sort of semblance of sense of it, give ourselves a narrative framework to understand in order to make that pivot away from what happened, because we can't pivot away from what happened until we understand it to what it means for us, right? And I think that this is, it's all about empowerment for me. And we don't, it's like you walked out your front door and some guy hit you in your leg with a baseball bat and broke your leg. Now, yeah, we want to focus on what the fuck did that guy just do, breaking my leg? But in order to heal, you have to deal with the broken leg, right? You have to go to the doctor, you have to get a cast. It's the same thing with narcissistic abuse. Yes, we want to acknowledge the victimhood and the crazy making nature of dealing with one of these people, but ultimately the healing is dealing with ourselves. And it's not victim blaming to say, this is where it's different in parental versus romantic relationships. The child is trapped in a relationship they did not choose. And like it or not, we choose our romantic relationships, right? On some level, we're
Yeah.
choosing. And so it doesn't do me any good to pretend I have no power or agency over my choices. It doesn't mean I'm blaming myself to say, like, well, what role did I have in my own choices? How am I showing up in relationships? What did the narcissist exploit in me, basically, right? Because again, it's all about like life, mental health. It's about it's about self, right? I really believe that like the vast majority of so-called mental health conditions are about our relationship to self, right? That they're about like how we see ourselves, how we talk to ourselves, how we interpret ourselves. It's obviously interplaying with other people and with shared reality. But when I start to think of them, I really think so much of this is about our relationship to self. And so
Well, you know
people
what
do,
happens? People get it's entertaining
yeah.
to learn about the
Oh yeah,
narcissistic stuff.
yeah.
Like it becomes entertainment. It's kind of like almost a hobby for people to go in there, learn about this bad thing the narcissist does. And
Yeah.
yeah, it can be under the guise of, I'm healing. But also people it's entertainment, I think, for a lot of
There's
people
also an
too.
overlap between neurodivergence and those who are narcissistically abused. There's something there that, like, a large portion of people that find themselves in relationships with narcissists seem to be neurodivergent. And it becomes our special interest because it's
Right.
morbidly fascinating. To me, narcissism is a window into human consciousness, right? Like that it's a window into understanding things on a deeper level because of the way, I was just talking about this. Like we talk about mental health, and people aren't going to like this, but we talk about it like it's scientific. It's not scientific. It can't. Your internal experience cannot be observed by a third party. The scientific method demands third party observation. And so we're talking about human consciousness. We're not. The conversation kind of centers around behavioral traits and observed behavior. And that's well and good. But ultimately, to truly understand these things is to try to understand the inner workings of the consciousness. I really think when we're talking mental health and mental illness, disorders, we're talking about human consciousness. We're talking about what we experience internally and how there are differing experiences for all of us, right? And so to me, the problem with this is kind of like that Mate book I never read, the myth of I've got it. It's called The Myth of Normal. But any sort of system that's quantifying disorders has to start with a baseline of what normal is. And to me, when we start talking about a normal experience of human consciousness, it gets into culture. It gets into what the culture is expecting, what the culture wants. And to me, it's mental eugenics. I don't use that term lightly, but it's like there's a way that, it's like we want blonde hair, blue eyed, 6'4" men. Um, we want people that think and feel this way. It feels very much the same to me. It's just a topic that's emerging and defies, again, like I think there are scientific components to understanding mental health, but like talking about narcissism as genetic, which I have bent a little bit that I believe there's probably a genetic component to it, but doesn't that just bend to determinism really quickly? Then if it's genetic, then are any of us in control of our behaviors? Is it all genetic? And where does that end? Like where does one begin and where does one end?
Well, that depends on what avenue you go down, because if you listen to someone like Sam Harris, he doesn't believe in free will. And so that's part of the reason why he doesn't, because if you go down that road, so many things that contribute to who you are, your parents,
I believe
your
that too.
genes.
I go more for Robert Sapolsky,
Okay.
but he's Stanford, and what he says is it looks like we're having intentional behaviors, but where is the intent coming from, right? And so it's like
Right.
I could force myself to eat chocolate if I didn't like chocolate, but I couldn't force myself to like it, and that might be kind of simplistic, but I think there's a mixture of genetics and conditioning that dictate our choices. And like I can stand up and sit down and call that free will, but like I don't I think that's a very
Right.
surface layer understanding
I
of.
mean, this is what I was thinking about that, where I think just the ability to learn how to talk, I mean, that is an example of something that's completely environmental, right? If you were not around people that talked, you would not learn English or
But
any
how do we
language.
know that we're even picking up language, right? To me, this gets into like primordial mind and all of these kind of like the
Well,
paranoid schizoid position, the
if you
primary
go,
process of like what are we hardwired to know? I think of it more as like animalistic, right? That we're
okay,
still evolved apes. And so, we like to elevate ourselves from the animal kingdom in ways that, we have evolved in ways that, but I think it's really interesting to start contemplating these things. I mean, I like those theories that place narcissists in the paranoid schizoid position. I go more to this guy, Michael Robbins, in the primordial mind, which is like, think of like the human mind before language enters our consciousness, right? And so there's no linguistic description. So primordial mind, they call like the body mind, the somatic mind, which is something feels good, it's good. Something feels bad, it's bad. It's black and white, no nuanced, right? And to me, that sounds like narcissism. But it's also, man, I haven't read on it in a while. It's also non-concrete in its interactions with language. Like somebody operating out of primordial mental activity uses words in a concrete way, which I also think narcissists do, which is meaning in a weird way that like the words aren't representations of the thing, the words are the thing. And so they're living in this layer of reality that is not defined by experience and material reality, but by linguistic descriptions of them, right? And so I'm kind of going off there,
you
but
know, I'm not as familiar with that. I have to take a look. The primordial mind is called.
yeah, I've got a book on it. Like I learned it like I was working with this therapist who is into DBR, like deep brain reimaging, I think it's called, and
Mm,
he was an EMDR practitioner. And he gave me an article on trauma, and the article started talking about primordial mind and how we're born with primordial mind. And as the cognitive mind emerges through education, the primordial mental activity recedes, but that trauma survivors seem to retain more primordial mental activity for whatever reason than the cognitive brain, right? And so
interesting.
to me, it speaks to like the evolution of mind and the evolution of consciousness in a certain way that like thinking and language are different layers of reality than experience, right? That we start with experiential reality and then we move into the reality of language. But is language Korzybski says language is the map, reality is the territory, right? And so the confusion of map and territory, the utility of the map, how accurate is the map? I mean, I truly believe when we're talking about issues of consciousness that the English language limits us. Something like Sanskrit, for instance, has a much more wider range of words and concepts in the language of consciousness. And I think the linguistic structures we've created around mental health, rooted in the idea of illness and disorder, don't actually help our mental health. I think they hurt it.
I can
that
see
I,
that. I can
I
see that
think
for
that,
sure.
like, when we think we're sick or we think we have an illness, because the way we're experiencing consciousness creates problems within our individual culture, right? If we didn't have to get up and go to work every day and give all of our time away, some of these issues wouldn't be as problematic, right? If
Right.
indigenous cultures recognizing schizophrenia more as like shamanistic, right, as a door into other realities, as opposed to like a crazy person,
Yeah. I
I
want
don't
to
know.
circle back to this though, real quick. I said before, people watch the content for entertainment, and I
Yeah,
want to emphasize that's not the only reason. It's still
yeah,
very serious. I don't want to minimize what people are going through. It is. It absolutely can be life or death. I mean,
yeah,
I'm
oh yeah, yeah,
focusing on
yeah,
true crime stuff more lately. There's that's a lot of this what's going on here. These true crime things happen from these kinds of
yeah,
abusive
absolutely.
relationships.
Two
And
things
then
can be true at once,
yes, exactly.
yeah.
And you also mentioned you say a lot of neurodivergent people, it becomes a special interest for them. And I think there's something to that as well. I do think there's something to narcissistic people choosing neurodivergent people as romantic partners. But what do you think about that?
I think that there's something in the ether. Like, it has to kind of deconstruct how we choose partners, because I'm not sure it's as cognitive as we think it is, because we don't really know people. We might look at surface level characteristics. We think this person's hot, whatever. But I think there's something about the way those two, I mean, a question is narcissism neurodivergent, would you say? That's a topic for another time, but I
That's
think,
an interesting question. I know people have said that, right? Or they'll say,
well, is it a neurotype in the way that we speak of, I tend to think the operating system, metaphor kind of speaks to it being more like that than actually a collection of traits. But I think there's something about those two kind of ways of being that slide into one another. Like, the neurodivergence is the cup, and the narcissist is the water. And there's something
mm,
that, like, I struggle to articulate what it is. And I think, I think neurodivergence can be uncertain in romantic relationships, can be uncertain in how to interpret nonverbal cues, and need a level of certainty. And that the narcissistic process of love bombing, which is mirroring back to their partner or victim, however you want to say it, this idealized version of them, feels very soothing to the neurodivergent, because at least in that period of the relationship, it feels certain. It feels like I've met my person. It feels like but it's more about the narcissist somehow, like, mirroring, back to us what we want to see about
uh,
ourselves. It's like Backman calls it the shared fantasy. I believe that to be true. I think it gets into an interesting question, though, about how would narcissists do that without empathy, right? Because there's something that they're doing that like maps who we want them to be, right? In the early stages, in the
well,
idealization phase.
let me ask you this. I think for me, and I've felt this, there's some form of you feel compatible in a way, I
Mhm.
think, with certain narcissistic people. And again, it doesn't mean it'll be a healthy relationship down the line. Of course it won't. But I've been trying to figure out, is it that? Like they're really just reflecting back and like kind of just more love bombing? But there does seem to be something that it seems to fit,
Yeah,
like you said. And
yeah.
I've been wondering, is it that? Or is it more from the fact that having a narcissistic parent makes it seem like it's fitting in that
Well,
way?
that true. I think that exists outside of the neurodivergent thing, where I think we are conditioned within our family relationships to what relationships feel like. And so a parental relationship, like all relationships with narcissists, defines the relationship space unconsciously as a space where we're abandoning ourselves. We have to abandon ourselves to remain in that relationship. And so then when we go out into the world, it feels very natural for us to abandon ourselves. And that slides right into the dictates of the narcissist, right? Of like being the person the narcissist says you are instead of the person that you are. And so again, it's about us in a certain way, learning to maintain self energy and maintain authentic self in relationship spaces where I know I struggle with this immensely as I try to go out and have healthy relationships, of kind of losing myself in a certain way, of standing up for myself, of that I can see now in my relationships the ways in the past that it would go, that like I wouldn't stand up for myself. I also think neurodivergence, autistic people, I know I consider myself autistic.
Me
in
too.
my in my relationships, in my friendships over life, I've always kind of had a dominant friend that kind of did the social, like a lead blocker in social situations,
I
kind
can
of,
relate to that. Yeah.
right? And so, and then I'd kind of mirror them. It wasn't like narcissistic mirroring, but it's like an autistic person who's kind of unsure how to succeed in social settings. Having a person that like protects them in a weird way from having to feel weird or having to feel on the outside looking in. And I think the narcissist feels that way early on, that like they are a dominant force in a lot of ways in the relationship space. And that feels comforting in that we don't have to kind of navigate some of these social systems on our own,
That's a
so,
fascinating thing that you brought that up, where, especially when I was younger, I would attract, platonically, mind you,
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah,
more dominant type men. And some of them, when
yeah,
they were like around my age,
yeah,
some of them would be not quite good. They like kind of bully and take
yeah,
advantage of the
yeah,
relationship, but not always. But
yeah,
that was a dynamic that used to happen to me all the time. And I would kind of just take their lead. I would like follow in their
yeah,
footsteps,
yeah,
take
yeah,
their lead a little bit. But now that I've developed more of a supplement routine and I've become more confident and assertive. Now that doesn't happen anymore.
right,
And
right,
I've wondered about why that is too. But like it used to be something where it reminded me of something I read in a boundaries book, where there's like people that seem helpless sometimes. They find that's a way they get their needs met.
yeah,
They
yeah,
seem helpless,
yeah,
and people want to take care of you when you seem helpless sometimes.
yeah,
Not
yeah.
everybody, but some people.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I used to look at that through the lens of my narcissistic dad, and that I was actually seeking a father figure in my peer group, and
Yeah.
I don't know that it's one or the other, because I think always consciousness isn't one thing or the other, it's all things at once, and so there can be many kind of rivers flowing into that one ocean. But I've thought about it a lot, because like I had one in high school, and then I went to college and had one, and the one in high school then didn't like me anymore because they said I changed. But I realized it was just me. I did change. People change when they go to college, but it was like me kind of blending into my environment. And I realized now it was this kind of shaky sense of self that's either rooted in neurodivergence, or it's rooted partially in the kind of way that the narcissistic dad, I mean, my dad, his narcissism reflected more in neglect than control, right? That I think he's more on the psychopath level of like, he just doesn't give a single fuck, right? And he didn't want me to be like him. He's a windsurfer, didn't teach me to windsurf. Yoga meditation teacher never taught me yoga or meditation. Owned record labels, didn't want me working in the music business. And so there was no like way for me to be like him. He literally didn't want me to be like him. I think it was like that kind of narcissistic jealousy of their children. But when I look at these different friends, I see a child in search of an identity, right? In search of not just social protection, but identity,
Now let me ask you this too, because you might maybe think of this. Now, as another autistic person, did you notice yourself gravitating towards much older people that would be like more father figures? Like I know that's something that I had a lot of pseudo father figures in
Yeah,
my life,
yeah, yeah,
and I
yes,
think it was perhaps a combination of things. I don't know if it was
yeah,
from being autistic or the
yeah.
fact that I used to not get along very well with my dad, like
Hmm.
having a narcissistic parent. I think
Hmm.
my dad was like comorbid, honestly,
Hmm.
narcissistic slash
Hmm.
autistic. It can be difficult for
I
me
think the same for me with
to
my
even
dad.
tell the difference. So it's
Yeah,
like not
yeah,
it's
yeah,
not cut and dry. But I've
yeah.
wondered like, okay, I didn't have that relationship, so I gravitated toward these mentor type relationships where
Yes. I
people,
was a terror in high school, right? But I always had teachers, male teachers that I was close with. One I talked to this day, I threw a pencil at him. He one time put me in a double chicken wing, and like I would terrorize them. I was also a really good basketball player. And even though I had all these emotional problems, I'd get texts, I'd throw the ball at the ref. I was always told I was incredibly coachable, right? And I think that that's what it was that we're unconsciously searching for a father figure, for a mentor, for or even more kind of bluntly, for connection, for somebody to care for us, to somebody to see us, and kind of be in our lives. And to, yeah, absolutely, sorry, I didn't mean to
you
cut
know,
you off. I got
no, no, no.
excited.
I think like for me, I got acceptance from them, right? They
Yeah,
were like they
yeah,
treated me better, I thought, than my own like dad treated me at the time. Like my dad would be very hypercritical, belittling,
yeah,
etc. But then
yeah,
these other guys would come along and they'd be like, "Oh, Jared, you're pretty cool." Like, and I'm not talking about in a creepy way at all. It's like no, just like a
yeah,
male
yeah,
friendship,
yeah,
and they would say, and they'd be accepting. I'll say you're smart, and things I didn't really hear very much. I didn't really
yeah,
hear that
yeah,
much at
yeah,
home. So it's
yeah.
another reason I would gravitate towards that. And I think probably a combination of both is the reasons, right? Not having a good relationship with
Yeah.
my dad and then being on the spectrum as well. The combination, it just it could fit. That whole
Yeah, yeah,
dynamic seemed to
yeah,
fit.
yeah. It made me think, like, I honestly think of my basketball career as a trauma response, to be honest. Like that there was like my mother like loves sports and she has histrionic tendencies and she has her own things and she never loved me more than when I was a basketball star. Every time I put the ball in the hoop was approval basically. And so like I grew up playing soccer, I could score a couple goals a game, but basketball, you could put 20 shots in a game, and but also as a mechanism of control. I had no control in my family unit. I felt very aimless. I'd go outside even in the dead of winter, and every time I put the ball in the hoop, it felt like I could control. There was something in control. I think sports is a really interesting area of exploration for traumatized children and even autistic women. I see a lot of autism in the NBA, for instance. Like I think of Ron Artest in The Malice in the Palace as an
Yeah.
autistic meltdown, that he actually did what he was supposed to do. He's having a meltdown. He goes, sits on the table. Somebody throws a beer on him and it's on. But like, there's a story of him like in his first year with the Bulls, had to be told by the Bulls he had gotten a job at Best Buy while he was on the Bulls for their discount, and they had to explain to him like you can't work at Best Buy. To me, like when I hear him, I hear neurodivergence. I think it's a game that like is this kind of like individual team dynamic where you're like operating individual within the framework of a
Yeah.
team that I think really like works for neurodivergent people. I remember for me, I was horrible in sixth grade, and then by seventh grade, I was like an all-star in my league. And it was because I think in patterns and systems, because I had figured out like footwork, I had figured out player movement and spacing and all of these things. And then my compulsive need to kind of put the ball in the hoop.
Yeah. Is basketball a special interest for you?
I'm getting back to it, with all of this trauma stuff over the last 10 years. I found myself like I almost like broke down who I was. And I found basketball and music and all of my interests kind of fell by the wayside for a while. But also my joy did, right? Like living in these spaces of really focusing on narcissistic parents or trauma, but I'm finding it again, like there's also like, like my dad and I would go to basketball games a lot when he owned a business and he could expense the season tickets. And then when he sold his business, we never went to another game again together, which speaks to the narcissistic dad, where like it wasn't really about connection with me, or it would have continued because he sold his business for quite a bit of money. He totally could have continued this tradition, what I thought was a tradition. And so I always say, like, in the recovery from narcissistic parents from complex trauma, there's like this moment, and I envision it as we're like suspended in water, and there's all of these kind of threads out to like what our interests are. And we have to kind of go over them. And are these our interests? Was this really something I was interested in? Or was this like me attempting to connect to my parent? And
Yeah.
it can be both. That's what I learned. And
Yeah.
so it was like basketball. Did I really love that? Yes, I did. Music, my dad owned record labels. And so was music this thing? No, I really love music. Movies. Do I love movies? We would go to movies every Saturday. No, I really love them. And so it was like reclaiming those, but through the lens of like, I want them. This isn't me trying to connect to them, right? It's my own life, and they might have kind of emerged as attempts to connect to the unconnectable, but they're mine now. And I do. I love basketball.
Yeah.
I don't play much anymore because like I've fallen out of like shape and kind of, but like I'm getting back into the NBA, and I
I
think
get you.
yeah.
I mean, for me, I used to play hoops by myself for hours
Yeah,
as
oh
a
yeah,
kid.
yeah,
I think
yeah,
that might have been conducive to the autistic piece too, where
yeah,
basketball is one of the few sports where you can do it by yourself. You
yeah,
can
yeah,
shoot,
yeah,
just
yeah.
shoot all, and I would do that by myself for hours. And I always remember one of the times I was in a drug and alcohol rehab, like I was maybe 19 years old at the time, and my brother and mom came to visit, and they said, Jared, there you were shooting hoops by
Yeah,
yourself
yeah,
at the rehab.
yeah.
There was my thing where I would just kind of do it by myself. And the other sports aren't as conducive to that. Like you
No,
can kick a soccer ball in the net, but not
yeah.
quite the same. Hockey, same thing.
Football, you need more people. You can't throw the
Yeah,
ball to
but
yourself.
basketball very
Yeah.
conducive to just you.
I honestly think it was like a form of meditation as well, in a weird way, that there was something. I was a very shy kid, but then when I got on the court, I had this aggression and anger. And that was the other thing. I could let out this anger that I'd get in trouble for in class. If I threw a meaty elbow on a drop step in basketball, they'd be happy I did that, and score. And so there was this like way of like being free to be yourself emotionally in a certain way within the confines of the game. That I look back and I think, wow, that was really lucky I had that outlet in this life where I felt so alone, and I felt so out of control in my family unit, and I felt like I was in trouble all the time. There was this one thing, and I was outside all the time I mean, I had neighbors too I'd play with, but it was, it was something that allowed me a time to like shut my brain off. It's funny because like I quit, like I was supposed to play in college, but then the sophomore to junior summer, my house burned down.
Hmm.
And I lost everything I owned, and I was living in a residence inn by myself as a 16-year-old with parents that were nowhere to be seen. My mother consumed with the house fire and everything. My dad, who had just built a massive house 5 minutes away, didn't invite us to live with him. And so inevitably I got in trouble smoking pot. I mean, I had a hotel room by myself as a 16-year-old. And I ended up getting into an argument with my coach over it and just quitting. I thought I would play. I was playing on an all-state AAU team, and I thought I'll just continue playing AAU. Fuck high school. But then my AAU coach got hired as a college coach who I had a good relationship with, which meant I couldn't even speak to him without it being like an official college recruiting
uh,
thing. And it just fell by the wayside. And it's one of these things that like I try not to regret too much, but the loss of that was really damaging. But my point was I then shifted to being a pothead, and in this weird way, like they filled the same they filled the same thing,
right.
this place to go to get away from the trauma brain, or to get away from the kind of feelings of neurodivergence, discomfort in social settings, or
Escapism. I did the
escapism.
same thing, right? I
Yeah,
did the
yeah,
same thing. And when those hobbies go and then the drugs and the booze take their place, generally not a good step. Like you don't
yeah.
usually see that end too well. But
I wish there was this really dramatic moment, and this is more of the narcissistic dad stuff, where like I'm sitting in a meeting with my coach, my mom, and my dad, and my mom's literally crying to my dad saying, "You have to make him play. This is a horrible decision he's making." And she was right. And my dad, who just saw all of this free time of not having to go to games, he never played basketball with me. He didn't care, saying,
yeah,
well, he should make his own decisions. And the coach, whose son was behind me on the depth chart, he only had one son, one chance to coach his son, probably not caring too much because then his son gets to play. And like me just being like drowning in trauma and neurodivergence that nobody's acknowledging just kind of shut down, and like,
that's a tricky one, right? Because your dad had a point. Like, yes, he
yeah,
should make
yeah,
his own
yeah, yeah,
decisions, but
yeah.
at the same point, the reason for quitting was not probably
It
good,
was a
right?
horrible. I try not to beat myself up. I don't think I would have made the NBA, but I see my friends that went on to coaching careers, or that stayed around the game through their college career, and what avenues it would have opened up. And it was an inflection point, and I was in a weird way punishing myself, I think, to hurt my parents. I really think there was this kind of like nihilistic component on my end. I know now I would, with the house fire, losing everything I owned, on top of already being a traumatized child, I really think I was in some sort of traumatic shutdown, and that like there was no space made for how traumatic it was to kind of lose everything.
Right.
Like, and then to not have my dad like offer a place to live, like it was a difficult.
Cold. Sounds very cold.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think, I mean, honestly, if you didn't make that decision, you probably wouldn't be talking to me right now.
No,
That would have
no.
completely changed the trajectory of your
Yeah,
life.
yeah, and so again, it's not like looking back so much with regret and contempt for my teenage self, but seeing truthfully that that was an inflection point. My coach was saying that, like you're
Yeah.
going to regret this, and
I have some of those too. Yeah.
again, like I don't think it's so much regret as like I wished I had made a decision rooted in what I true, or I wish I had known how much I loved basketball, and how good it was for me at that point in my life. And that you don't, they tell you when you're that age, you don't get a redo, but you don't have the context or the kind of experience to truly like understand what that means. And yeah, I mean, I really, I see my old AAU coach from time to time. He was an old Marquette player, and it's always really bittersweet because I love the guy. He gave so much to. I mean, he was an AAU coach for a long time, and his kind of goal was getting kids who may not have gone to college to college. Now, I was always going to go to college, so that didn't really apply to me. I sometimes joke like, "You just hired me so my dad would pay for the uniforms, or you just chose me." But I was good, but it's nice to look back on those things and meet my teenage self with compassion and curiosity and understanding instead of like blame and like how could I have done that and blah 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 blah. That does no
Yeah.
good.
I mean, it helps when you can see you're in a good spot now, right? And I always say that to people, right? People that are in narcissistic relationships, everyone wishes they learned about it sooner. And it's
Mm-hmm.
easier to think, like I think now, oh, I learned it when I was supposed to. It's
Mm-hmm.
easier for me to say
Mm-hmm.
that now
Yeah,
that I feel like, okay, things are going pretty
yeah,
good. But if
yeah,
things were not going pretty good, I totally get that it's going to be
yeah.
much harder to believe that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think to talk about like helping people recover from narcissistic abuse. That's such a common sentiment. Is like I wish I had known sooner, but you didn't know what you didn't know, and
Right.
there's no value in kind of beating ourselves up. I really think so much of the recovery, or at least a big component of the recovery that's crucial, is in doing away with the harsh inner critic and learning to speak to ourselves gently about these types of issues, right? And learning to kind of be kind to ourselves and the mistakes we may feel we've made, and accept that, like you said, these things happen in the time they're kind of meant to happen. I think it's easy to kind of beat ourselves up. Like there's all these signs here. I think of that in like going no contact with my dad, but like I didn't want to until I was ready. Like I still hold out this weird sliver of hope that there might be some, not reconciliation, but like some, like basically I might see him before he dies. We'll put it that way.
No, I get you. Now, and you're someone like me that you didn't realize you were on the spectrum until later in life. And I do think there's a correlation between that and having a narcissistic parent. I think a lot of narcissistic parents, I don't think they wanted to be the parent that had an autistic child,
No,
especially 30, 40 years ago ish, right?
no,
There's a whole bunch more stigma back then. I mean, I made a video about this. Some people didn't like it, but a lot of people really related to it and said, "Oh yeah, that sounds about right." They acted like, "Oh, you're fine, you're normal, you're
yeah,
this,"
yeah.
but in reality, no, it was different.
Well, and it translates to you're not trying hard enough. You see these videos of mother like forcing their autistic children into pools, or kind of, trying to control the behavior or force the behavior. And I also think that like just the kind of traumatic conditioning of the narcissistic parent creates a form of CPTSD that, whether it's autism or not, functionally it's almost the same of being on the spectrum, and that it's kind of hard to parse the nuance into kind of all of these things.
It's tough because I think if you're on the autistic spectrum, then you're more likely to develop CPTSD or traumatic cognitive dissonance. They kind of go hand in hand.
I love that term. Dr. Salerno, I heard, maybe he came up
Yeah,
with that term. I
I
love
think
that
he did.
term. Yeah, yeah. He's been doing such great work. I've
It's a
come.
good way to put it because it
Yeah,
adds in the gaslighting and the truth
yeah,
distortion
yeah,
part as
yeah,
opposed to the simple, I'm not sure I call it simple, but just the abuse part from trauma,
yeah,
etc.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that kind of way that we're not allowed to be who we are in a narcissistic family overlaps with what you're talking about a parent that can't accept a child's autism. I still struggle with this with my mother. Is that like I look at my life and I see autism and complex trauma as like this obvious, like the signs are like glaring signs, and she still has a hard time, um, I think, accepting these things, and it's just an extension of what I experienced in childhood, is this kind of denial of the fact that there was trauma involved, despite the fact that I wet my bed till like seventh grade. I mean, and had all of these kind of. The coaches would always say I was withdrawn. I'd smile more. Like like there was this kind of like, you know, me staring off into the middle ground all the time, of just not being totally there. We're looking at pictures of the first day of school, and I'm having like a complete emotional meltdown, and they're just snapping pictures and telling me to toughen up, and it's like,
I think it's very common for people that were undiagnosed on the spectrum, men and women both. Oh, smile more. Like the
yeah,
smile more thing is something I would hear all the time. Or they'd always
yeah,
say to me, it just looks like you're not here. It looks like you're
yeah,
just thinking really hard about
yeah,
something. But it was really just, I was just being me. But they always found a
yeah,
way to like poke at it and like the baseline wasn't okay. Like there's something
right,
wrong with you. We don't know what it is, but there's
yeah.
something about you that makes us a little uncomfortable.
For me, it was always like, you're not, like, I'm obviously smart, and I've always been kind of hyper intellectual in a weird way, but like I couldn't figure out how to tie my shoes on time. The first paper I wrote got turned back and said it was way below my grade level, and I had no idea what they meant by that. Like there was all of these kind of developmental quirks, let's say, or develop, that were looked at through the lens of like me not trying hard enough, instead of like what's going, like I couldn't keep my room clean, which is probably my ADHD. And my mother, instead of like recognizing I needed help learning to keep a clean room, just slamming the door and saying the cleaning lady's not going in there, when I needed somebody to sit with me and kind of help me develop routines because of the neurodivergence. It wasn't me just like throwing my shit. I didn't know why it was. I think so much of, I used to talk about like, in a narcissistic household, your dysfunction will be characterized as disobedience, right? And so instead of being seen as a dysfunctional child struggling, you'll be seen as a functional child not trying hard enough, and that it becomes like this vortex of trauma, because there's the trauma of not being able to live up to the standards and struggling internally because it's not intentional, we don't know why, and then the way that we're treated because of that, and it creates this like, impossible situation where we desperately want to be taught, or we want somebody to take the time with us to recognize like we're not a bad kid misbehaving. We don't know how to do these things. It's
Did you struggle to tie your shoes as a kid?
Yeah.
Yeah,
But then I
you
realized it was because like when I finally did it, I did it in less steps than like this.
because there's a friend of mine. I think she helped this other guy with a book, and that was part of the title about not being able to tie his
So I see
shoes.
I see that as like I don't understand individual steps of things until I understand the system, right? Like I think systematically or in patterns, and that I've always had, like, it's weird. I was a graceful basketball player, but I've always had strange issues with my fine motor skills when it comes to like tying your shoes, right? I've never felt like, and there's a word for this that's related to autism. I can't ever remember what it is, but like I never felt like completely in control or aware of how my body was moving. Like again, to basketball, my coach would yell at me like, "Bend your fucking knees," and I'd be going like I am bending my knees, but apparently I wasn't, right? And
Right.
there's a word for this, but I never really felt like I was filling out my body in the, like like doing crossovers. Like I couldn't do some of those like dribble moves because I didn't have like a internal conception or map of the way my body was moving. I
Right.
don't know if that's
I think
weird.
it has something to do with the GABA system in people that have autism. They say people with autism their GABA system functions differently, and
Mhm.
they have low glutathione. So I've seen that makes perfect sense to me, though.
Yeah, yeah. And so I mean, all of these clues that I was, you know, I recognize this was the 80s and the 90s. So the definition of autism back then was basically a picture of Dustin Hoffman from Rain Man,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
if you weren't like some math genius with absolutely zero social skills, then you weren't autistic. But like, it creates a really, I don't know if this will resonate with you. It's when I started to understand I was autistic, there was like skill regression, and it created like almost a depression in that it felt less workable than maybe seeing those traits or behavioral patterns through the lens of like complex trauma. And there's
Hmm.
been this strange negotiation in myself of acceptance and almost feeling like unworthy of that label, or feeling guilty. It's come with a lot of complex kind of
Interesting.
internal.
I think it makes you think of things in a different way. Like if you
Yeah,
look back
yeah.
at your behaviors as a kid, it's you think of it one way if you look at it through the lens of CPTSD or traumatic cognitive dissonance, but then you might look at it a little bit differently if you
Yeah,
see it through the lens of, oh, I was
yeah,
on the autistic spectrum. I could
yeah,
totally see
yeah,
that.
yeah. Well, it was weird because like I always appeared to have a lot of friends, and I did have a lot of friends, but it was like I was masking. Like I would move from social group to social group. I was this person that could be hanging out with the jocks one night, and then the stoners, and then the
Yeah,
hunters.
me too. Yeah.
And like, and like that was looked at as like evidence that I wasn't autistic. Well, you always had friends, but I see it as evidence that I was, because I
Yeah.
was just kind of masking and bending my behavior. I've always had trouble with eye contact. Like job interviewing is really hard. Like I remember in my bar days, a girl I was hanging out with kind of got me a job interview. And she was like, at her company, and she's like, yeah, the guy said you kind of weirded him out and didn't make eye contact, And I look back at that and I kind of just laugh, like, yeah, duh. Like, I've always had trouble in those settings.
Yeah, I
But
had that too. I mean, this my supplement routine has really helped me with some of that stuff, like being more confident and assertive. But like for me, that was one of the worst symptoms for me was the anxiety that I felt. I think that was
yeah,
my version of it. Now, I don't think everyone has that same version.
yeah,
But I think the fact that I had that version really influenced how I turned out because
yeah, yeah.
I've often will wonder, well, what's the version of autism that you should simply accept, and what's the things that you can improve? It's like the serenity prayer, right? Like,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
accept the things you cannot change, have the courage to change the
yeah,
things you can, the wisdom to
yeah.
know the difference. It's like, well, if I have this anxiety, is that something I should just be accepting? Or since there's ways to improve it, should I? I've wondered about that a lot.
Yeah, I think that like I use the word acceptance a lot, and people kind of like interpret it as like surrender, as though the acceptance means it. I kind of split the difference with that, and just accept myself as I am. But then that leads to kind of improvements, right? We start from a place of acceptance. But yeah, I mean, I struggle with that too. Of like, I think that's kind of what I was getting at in the difference between seeing it through the lens of autism or CPTSD. And they can overlap. I mean, again, it's like creates complex trauma to live a childhood and adult life with undiagnosed autism, ADHD. That creates trauma. And so I think again, these things are always much more like intertwined than like looking at them through the lens of like this is that and this is that and this is this.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, as I've gotten older, I think sometimes the answers become more hazy as opposed
yeah,
to more
yeah,
clear sometimes. Like
yeah.
I start seeing it from more angles. And I don't know the answer to that question that I just posed about what to accept, what not to accept. I think there's pros and cons to
Yeah,
both
yeah,
methods. There's more like
yeah,
trade-offs in some cases,
yeah.
but as I've gotten older, I've noticed that a little bit. I've noticed,
There's
I see more sides, I see more perspectives now.
there's a Bertrand Russell quote that says, it's amazing how much a man needs to know he knows nothing.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this, like, as knowledge expands, so does the acknowledgement of how little we actually know, that like, um the more we know, the less we know. It's this weird, kind of contradiction. But I
Yeah.
think about that in narcissism. We were talking about that earlier, where like when I first started, it was me like having read a book or two and just channeling my own experience with the belief that my dad was a narcissist, and I could just very easily cue it up. But the more I've read and the more I've come to understand, in certain ways, the less certain I am about my own understanding of it, and human consciousness in general too, where it's just like, there's another quote, like it's a Cormac McCarthy quote from Blood Meridian, like, there's more that exists outside of my comprehension than within it, or something like that,
Ah, I've heard a lot about that book. It's supposed to be a classic book.
it's a great book. There's a lot of really existential quotes. I'm reading another book of his right now. I tend to really like him, but you need like a dictionary. I mean, he's
Yeah.
very like,
Is he the guy that wrote No Country for Old Men?
he did. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. He
What's his
wrote
name?
that. Cormac McCarthy. He wrote The
Okay.
Road as well, which was like a really great and depressing book and movie. He's not easy to read because he'll start like, it's just all descriptive terms and like stuff you need a dictionary to know. But like Blood Meridian is this incredibly violent book about a gang of like criminals being paid by the US government to scalp Native Americans on the Mexican border in the late like 1800s. And so there's the character. They were talking about making it into a movie, same director as The Road, and this movie, The Proposition, that I love, which is an Australian Western, which is incredible if you've never
Oh,
seen it. With
interesting. No, I've not seen
Nick
that.
Cave wrote it, Guy Pearce is in it. And so they've been talking about making Blood Meridian into a movie, but then McCarthy died, and it kind of went into limbo because he was like a producer or something. But it is so violent. There's like this page-long sentence describing an oncoming horde of Native Americans that kind of tells the story of conquest, and like in what they're wearing, because they're wearing like conquistador pauldrons and bloody wedding dresses, and like all of the people that have come at the indigenous peoples, in attempts to colonize, are reflected
Ah, fascinating. I've heard a
in
lot of good things.
yeah,
I've been of the notion that fiction books can be more valuable than nonfiction books in many ways in terms of teaching lessons.
I think so. I mean, I think like there's time for both. I mean, I mentioned film studies as part of my degree. My degree was called literature, culture, and media, and so it was like film studies, literature studies, cultural studies, media studies. Basically, with my ADHD autism, I realized I could watch movies and read books and write about them, and that could be my college degree. And so I gravitated towards that because I've always had trouble studying anything that doesn't interest me. And McCarthy is, yeah, he's an interesting author to explore. I think
Absolutely.
literature creates empathy. Literature helps us think outside of ourselves. Literature, helps us with our vocab. There's so many benefits, I think, to kind of reading nonfiction, or reading
Absolutely.
fiction rather.
I also recommend John Steinbeck's East of Eden
Oh
for
yeah,
that reason
oh
too.
yeah, oh yeah.
I wanted to ask you this though. What was the experience like for you being autistic and a scapegoat in your family?
It was all really hard, actually. I mean, I think like it speaks to this idea of the dysfunction being characterized as disobedience, right? And so I was seen within my family as, an irresponsible party boy. And I was. There's no question about that. I played that role really well, but there was this like isolated, alone autistic child in there doing the best he could, that it was really hard for me to reconcile. I think, we talked earlier about this period of anger I went through, that I was abusive in a lot of ways within my family system, because this rage would come out. Um, and it was part of that rage was the way that I had been characterized, combined with the fact that my parents didn't speak to one another really, other than to argue over money. And so there were different expectations. I had to be a different person in a different setting each time, and it created like real rage. And to this day, it's actually really hard. I mean, there's this part of me that just wants my family to understand and forgive me. You know, we talk
Right.
about forgiving the narcissist. A lot of times, it's the narcissist that needs to forgive their children for fucking struggling and being human, dealing with things they didn't understand. You know, if you talk to my dad, it would be, I'm the one that needs to apologize because I was threatening him and I was, expressing all of this anger that had to come out, and he was the victim. And if you saw these emails, there would be no question I was
Right.
flying off the handle. But there was also a secret son that came up that he wouldn't acknowledge or talk to me about. There was him for 40 years saying, come back to me when you're not angry, and never allowing my emotions into the relationship, and how that accumulated for 40 years. And when I started to feel it, it came out in this vicious rage that I feel shame, I feel guilt for it, but like I also know that like why that occurred. And while I can feel regret and understand like, wow, that was like really intense, I can also say like this guy didn't allow me to be a human being. He did things in his life. He destroyed his family, of which I was a part of. And I had every right to be angry, especially at 7 when it happened. But for that time between 7 and 40 when it started to come out, there was just like so much bullshit he pulled. I
I
mean,
mean, it
like,
sounds like that you want them to validate your perception of reality and accept like how you were, and
yeah,
I think that's totally understandable
I want
things,
them to
right?
love me, right?
Right.
I've been listening to a book by Pete Walker, CPTSD from Surviving to Thriving. It's a wonderful book. And he talks not about unconditional love, but unconditional positive regard, which
Carl Rogers.
that's who he's quoting. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, like to me, that at the crux of narcissistic parents, where they actually assume the worst of you. It's almost like unconditional negative regard,
Uh
that
huh.
everything you do, especially as the scapegoat, has to be used within their narcissistic bullshit to scapegoat you. So it's not you struggling with their narcissism. It's not you struggling with undiagnosed autism or ADHD. It's you fundamentally being a bad person. I
Yeah.
think of this intervention my mother. So when I'm 21, I'm going to school at the University of Iowa. I was forced to college. Like I couldn't even fill out a college application. My mother did it. She said, "You can't stay in the state. You're going to Iowa. Off you go." And so shockingly, it didn't go well. you know, I would get like 7 credits a semester, but I had a wonderful girlfriend. I had this girlfriend that was like not a drug user like I was, and we broke up. And I went into narcissist. I went into like autistic shutdown and whatever attachment, whatever you want to call it now through psychobabble. I dropped out of school, and my mother arranged this intervention, and she got my mom, my stepdad there, my mom, my stepmom, my dad, my sister, my uncle, and they all lied. Right? Like the reality was they didn't know me enough or care enough for them to actually have actual real examples of how my drug use affected them. And it was all this really like I'm kind of lost my train of thought as to why I was talking about this, but it's like, my dad said, "You crashed my Mercedes." I did do that. My stepmother said, "You think your dad's going to give you a high paying job in the music business, full stop." And I started thinking, where's the part about drug use?
Right.
My sister said, "You came to my graduation in Madison and I saw all these pills on the floor of your car as though they were like ecstasy pills. They were Prilosec pills. I wouldn't drive for 3 hours with like 30 years in prison just strewn throughout."
Right.
My mother said, like, "I'm so worried about you. I think you're going to die. I'm saving your voicemails." And I'm thinking, you forced me to college before I was ready. And it was just this, like, this was why I was going to say it. They literally said, "If you don't do this, we're going to abandon you." And this was the first time my mom and dad had been in a therapy setting. And so it was all I had ever wanted. And so I said, "Okay, I'm going to do it, right? Regardless of their lies, I'm going to do it." The therapist said, "If you don't do this, they're going to abandon you." And I woke up the first morning in rehab to the news that my dad announced he was going to Hawaii because it was too heavy for him and he wouldn't come out until I returned, which was abandonment. Then when I got out, the agreement was you're supposed to live with your dad for 6 months. After 2 weeks, he said, "My wife doesn't want you here. I got you an apartment. Your bags are packed. We're leaving right now." And it is like so abusive. Um, but people just see the drug use. They just see
Right.
like, yeah, yeah, I was this party boy. Yes, I did crash a Mercedes. Now the story of that was also too that I waited till 6 a.m., drove home, um, blew the legal limit, as in I wasn't drunk, and that it was actually the other person's fault in the accident report, but nobody cared. It was just, oh, Chris was drinking all night
Yeah. That
and crashed it.
they'll boil it down to that. I
Yeah,
mean, and the narcissistic parents, they will constantly give, especially people on the spectrum, the least charitable interpretation of everything.
yeah,
And
yeah.
like the little quirks that an autistic child will have, maybe the way they
Yeah,
stim. Like I would fiddle with my nose, and
yeah,
they would, my parents would be so pissed about it, and they'd be acting like it was a character flaw, or
yeah.
the fact that I didn't like looking people in the eyes, or like spending time alone, or I wasn't
Mhm.
very charismatic and confident back then. I wasn't a social butterfly. All those things were just terrible character flaws, and that was just something that I believed them for a while.
Right, right.
And the big thing that really changed my mind with that really got me to see it in a different perspective, is something that Meredith Miller said 6, 7 years ago. I don't know if you know her, but
Mhm.
you would probably really like her. But she had said, if you don't feel comfortable being yourself around somebody, there's probably a very good reason for that.
Right.
And just having it flipped in that way was mind blowing for
Yeah,
me, because I'd
yeah,
always been told, no, it's just you're the problem. And
yeah, yeah.
substances help that seem more true. Oh yeah, of course, you're the one abusing
Right.
opiates. You're the one drinking. So yes, you are the problem.
Culturally, it's very easy to understand that. It is not easy to understand the narcissistic parent. It's very easy to see a kid drowning in drugs and alcohol. But to me, when I look back, especially at my drinking, the drugs I think were a little different, but especially the drinking, it was a social lubricant. I also live in Wisconsin, for God's sakes. Like like everybody's like excess drinking. And so I actually had a pretty easy time quitting drinking. Like I've never, I left rehab. I've never had a drink. I can go to bars. Like I just, it's not, now if you put cocaine in the room there might be another story, but all of these things were interacting with one another, but it was the usage of those things by the family system in bad faith, right? That's the thing about the scapegoat. It's not a good faith effort to like improve the child's life or deal with these issues. It's to use the child's issues to distract from all of the dysfunction. I mean, I think I should be able to sue these therapists that did this intervention. Did they know my mom and dad didn't even speak to each other about parenting their child? My mom said, "Are we going to co-parent?" My dad goes, "No, I'll do it my way. You're going to do it your way." Did they know that was the first time they were ever in a room together to discuss the well-being of their child? I mean, like, what kind of bullshit was this? But it was just the cultural understanding. My dad's got some money. This is a spoiled rich kid.
Right.
Like he couldn't figure out college. Okay, but like I'm not good at school, right? Like I'm smart, but like school was never like I don't study. Like I couldn't study. Like I could just power through on like raw intelligence, but like it to this day, like I just don't learn in the ways that they wanted me to learn.
I mean, your intervention reminds me a lot of Christopher's intervention from The Sopranos,
Yeah,
if you've seen
yeah,
that.
okay. Probably 10 times. I
Right.
watch that show annually at least. Yeah. Yeah. There's so much to learn from that show actually. But yeah, it's and again, like, did I need help with my drug use? I probably did at that point a little bit, although I'm not entirely sure. Like I still struggle a little bit with like whether what I was doing, it walked right up to the line of like, okay, this that there needs to be, but what I do know is that the family wasn't doing that in good faith. Like nobody really participated. Like I ended up taking it seriously. But then once my dad, after the doctors, all these people we trusted arranged, like you need to live with him for 6 months. After he abandoned me after 2 months, after abandoning me after 24 hours, and I just like, why the fuck would I stay sober? None of these people care. Like they don't actually care about me. I mean, think of that. Like, and he's done that periodically of like me needing to stay there and then his wife not liking it, and so him just like kicking me out of the house for no reason other than I exist, and maybe I
Right.
was coming home a little later than they liked, but I'm like a 20-year-old kid. Like what do you want?
I'll tell you this though, the benefit of the substances is it steered me in the direction of self-help stuff. It steered me in the
Oh
direction
yeah, oh
as
yeah,
it did for you
oh
too.
yeah, yeah,
AA, NA.
oh
That
yeah.
stuff was life-changing for me, and I think that was one of the benefits, right? Okay.
I'd be dead if I didn't check. And that was the other thing. I checked myself in at 39, and my dad had to be convinced I needed to go. And then nobody showed up. But like without me, and I stayed for 3 months. And I always wonder, like, why'd you stay so much? And it was because I was learning to be loved actually by other people, that I found so much like camaraderie and unconditional concern in rehab with other people. Now there's obviously always problematic people too, but there was so much feeling of community. I didn't want to leave. Like it was really expensive, but like I didn't want to leave. And I've reflected on that. And it was like me learning to feel safe with people. I think rehab is such an interesting place because like it's this place where like whoever the fuck you are on the outside, it doesn't matter. So you'll have these like high-powered lawyers like huddling up with these little meth head street kids, and they're helping one another, something that would never happen. It
Yeah.
would never happen out in the real world. And I couldn't, nothing that I've gone on to do since then would have been possible. I was drowning. I mean, it was like I call myself like a pan drug user. It was like whatever you got,
Yeah.
like I'll do it. Like, not I never did meth, but like everything else was like, just give it to me. I just don't want to be in my body. I don't want to be in my mind. I just make it stop, and like, um, without that decision, I'm convinced I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have survived like fentanyl. I wouldn't have
Oh
like
yeah. Me
it
too.
just I wouldn't have survived it. Like I had to go to the emergency room one time. This was before anybody knew what it was, but I think I got it before it had entered because my nasal cavity closed. And so like 36 hours of not being able to breathe through my nose, I had to go to the emergency room. And I said, like, I was snorting, whatever. And they're like, that doesn't do that. I'm like, I can't believe it's a coincidence, and then I read later that that's possible to happen with fentanyl. And
See,
I,
a lot of the professionals they don't know. Like they should know, but they don't.
you know, I find I don't, I do think of AANA as kind of cultish. I do think there's a lot of ways that like there's a lot of criticism, but for me, early on, those like even like I didn't work through the entire 12 steps, but like there was something about taking responsibility, right? That set the foundation for then saying, and also I had this narcissistic parent, and so much of what I had to do was not actually my fault, but it was only taking responsibility for the things that using the serenity prayer, for the things that I was in control of,
Yeah.
which is substance intake. And it was only through the kind of acknowledgement of that I could move on to like, yeah. And there was also all of this trauma that this wasn't like they called it partying. Sure, it might have looked like partying, but that was like slow rolling self destruction.
Right.
I always
And
kind
that's
of
the most
joke.
helpful part, though. Like that responsibility part is
Yeah,
humongous. I'm so
yeah,
grateful for that. That I
yeah,
was conditioned to do that, and that brought me on the path. I had many sixth sense moments before my narcissism sixth
yeah,
sense moment. Right,
yeah,
there was
yeah,
an
yeah,
addiction one, a
yeah, yeah,
relationship one, a
yeah,
mental
yeah,
health
yeah,
one. The
yeah.
narcissism one was one of the last ones, honestly.
That you just said grateful, and I've gotten so far away from my practice of gratitude. I used to do like on my early TikToks like daily gratitudes.
They're
And I'm
big.
somebody that hates toxic positivity, but I think gratitude is something entirely different, um, where it rewires our brain. Like when we have narcissistic parents, when we have trauma, it's hard for us to see anything to be thankful for. But life is dynamic. We have this whole mosaic of experience happening in front of our eyes, and there's always actually something. It's never good or bad. It's never one or the other. It's all things at once. And to choose something out of that mosaic that we're grateful for literally like rewires our capacity to see life through a more expansive lens, right? And it's, people sometimes shit on gratitude practices as toxic positivity, like it's forcing myself. It's not forcing us to be positive. It's forcing us to acknowledge that life is complicated and dynamic, and we should never go too far into the light or too far into the
Yeah.
dark. We should live in this middle where we're capable of all of it, right? We're capable of acknowledging the kind of scope of experience. And that was life. I mean, I'm weird. I sometimes wish I could go back to rehab. Like I think everybody should go there, even without substance problems, because it's this time where like it's really about healing, and there's all of these different dynamics, the dynamics with the other inmates, the dynamics with the counselors. Then you start going into the rooms of groups, and it teaches us. I haven't talked about this in a while, and it's really actually making me feel like nostalgic and good, because it was such an interesting experience, for me, to
Yeah.
kind of go to
I mean, I
rehab.
feel similar. I feel similar about the 12-step programs too, because I don't go there anymore either. And I think there is some cult like elements there for sure. But I do think of all the cult like places, that is one of the more positive ones. Like,
Yeah,
there are
yeah,
certainly negative cults out there.
yeah,
And again,
yeah.
that's part of what Mark Vicente talks about in the Narcissist Playbook. There is no shortage of negative cults out there. That's
Right,
for sure.
right. I it. I don't know. I can't quantify how transformational the experience was, rehab was, and like I think of times, I got sober, I went back to work, and kind of, I think a lot of us work. You talk about these sixth sense moments where when we go, we think the drugs and alcohol are the scope of the problem. We fix that, and all of a sudden everything's just gonna fall in line. And so for me, it was like I went back to work. I was working for this high-end men's shoe company called Allen Edmonds, and I went back to work. And about a year later, I started drowning in trauma, and I said, you know what, I'm quitting my job. I'm going to like go into like isolation a little bit, and start to figure out what this trauma stuff was. And the role that meetings played, even if simply for the fact of like, I broke myself down so much that I pushed away so many friends and family, and like just going and being with people was so crucial to survival, to literal survival. Because I went off my meds, and I said, I've got to feel all of this stuff, as scary
Yeah.
as it is. Like, I actually have to like go inward and kind of figure out like, what is this? Like, what am I experiencing? There's a movie called Don't Worry, He Won't Get Far on Foot. And it's Joaquin Phoenix, Gus Van Sant directs. It's set in Portland, which is where I went to rehab, outside of Portland. And it's a true story of this guy who was like an illustrator, kind of this edgy illustrator for like porno mags and like stuff, like Portland magazines too. But like, I think ultimately he was in like Playboy or whatever. Um, but it's about he becomes a quadriplegic, and it's about recovery. And usually recoveries movies fall flat on their face and become caricatures. But it served as a meeting for the times I couldn't like get out of my bed. Jonah Hill plays this kind of gay sponsor, and there are these moments of sheer transcendence in the movie. Like Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth is in it, and like Jack Black is in it. But it's also kind of a love letter to Portland. It's filmed in Portland, but it just captures the way recovery just expands your field of vision and expands your field of experience, and how, I always think of trauma and addiction like this tunnel, and our lives just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller until there's nothing but the addiction and the trauma itself, and how the recovery is just this beautiful like re-expansion of it all, that we start feeling joy again, we start seeing,
Interesting. I thought
the
of it as like the onion, right? I think like
yeah,
addiction and to drugs, alcohol is like the first outer layer of the onion,
yeah,
and then you keep on peeling away more layers.
yeah,
So like
yeah.
after the first layer, I realized, oh, I thought then maybe I was like dependent, and I was like a love addict type person. I was obsessed with romantic relationships, finding
Mhm,
the ideal love. Like that was the
mhm,
next layer. I uncovered that. Then under that layer was more like, uh-oh, why do I feel like I'm going through these like manias and depressions and this severe anxiety? And there was like the mental health layer. And what I discovered at the bottom of that was, yeah, all this anxiety, this lack of self acceptance, it was trauma, it was CPTSD, but it was also undiagnosed autism.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
and that
yeah.
explained a lot of
Yeah,
what I had been doing my entire life.
yeah. It's really like, I love these conversations, because it's so much of the conversation of narcissism is centered on the narcissist, that like the process of what we're talking about is like vital to life in a lot of
Oh,
ways. I mean, it's like, I we can think of like narcissistic abuse recovery as a form of deprogramming, right? Like
Yeah.
similar to coming out of a cult, or enlightenment of unlearning our conditioning to see life more clearly. But when we come out on the other end, it's like, I'm certainly not enlightened, but it's like this ability to like see this big mosaic of life, to recognize that there nobody, everybody suffers, and nobody needs to think they deserve suffering. But there's something in the understanding of our suffering and the deconstruction of our suffering, and quite frankly the acceptance of our suffering, that leads to the acceptance of joy and the acceptance of the kind of pendulum of those things, and that it frees us, you know, it frees us from the belief that we're alone in life and we're alone in our suffering, and it gives us a sense of connection, I think, to everything.
I think that's one of the reasons why those 12-step programs are so helpful. I mean, it serves many of the needs that just any human would have. A
Yeah.
need for a connection, community, some sort of spirituality, regardless of
Mhm.
what it is,
Mhm.
some purpose, some goals, like the clean time stuff is goals. Like it serves so many purposes in one,
Mhm.
giving back, the spiritual principles. And yeah, I've been trying to get back more into the gratitude programs too, because, but
Mhm.
like you, and this has been the issue for me in the narcissism stuff, the longer I stay in there, the more I would catch myself trying to avoid, like, I know the way certain people would see things. Oh, I'm trying to be
Mhm.
positive. Toxic positivity. And it's like,
Mhm.
okay, sometimes that is the case. Yes, sometimes there are people invalidating others with toxic positivity, but that doesn't mean there should be no gratitude program.
Right, right,
That
right,
that
right,
doesn't mean that there's still not benefits in those
right.
other things. So I've caught myself contorting to some of
Mhm.
the backlashes I would
Yeah,
get, and I've realized now, going too far down that road, I'm losing myself doing talking about the
I agree.
narcissist so much,
Yeah.
and because I was not like that always. Like I had a different view when I first started talking about narcissism. I was way more self-help and spiritual
Me too.
oriented
Me
back
too. I'm
then.
glad you said that, because I've actually been feeling like not good about myself in that regard, that like it's become like this caricature in a weird way of what I wanted to avoid, which was just being another person talking about narcissism.
Yeah.
That like I used to talk way more about CPTSD, about healing, when I was more engaged in those things, right? And
Yeah.
then all of a sudden I look at it like this. It's like like I just wanted to share myself at the beginning, right? And so it was taking what was going on offline and putting it online in hopes to create community. But then all of a sudden you get attention, you get all these followers, people start looking to you, and you become a creator instead of a sharer. And it like flip
Mm.
flops these things, where instead of just like bearing my soul, I'm now having to think about smart things to say. And it's more academic than I ever really wanted to be, because that's not me,
What you should be
right?
know you should be doing. You should be doing some, I think, live streams on YouTube because that is the purpose of that for me. Like I
Yeah.
do live streams, and you talk long enough, you'll
Mhm.
get to the exact nature, as they'll say. You'll
Oh,
get
I've done it. I used to
to
do
the
tons of
bottom of
them on
things.
TikTok. Yeah, yeah. I used to do tons of lives on
They're
TikTok.
helpful.
I was literally just talking about that with my girlfriend, that I need to do. You're right. Like it. I don't know if this will resonate, but it's like being on social media and all the feedback. It's like it's almost like I unmasked at the beginning to show myself, and then it almost forced me back into these weird like masking a little bit, because of the way that like my goal when I started was to be authentic and vulnerable online, and I did that. But what I started to realize is that like you or me, we can be authentic or as vulnerable as we want in these tiny little snippets of time, but the audience is still going to interpret us through their lens. And
Yeah.
so they will still reflect back idealization or devaluing. They will still reflect back something that's a little different than what we are authentically, right? And it's no blaming or fault. It's just the way these things work. And that like it's been a real like challenge lately, actually, to kind of make content. Like I've it's almost like you get to this point where it's like, what have I done? you
Yeah. No, I
know
totally get it. I think, and that's the lesson though too, right? That's the opportunity to reflect and to think,
yeah,
okay, well, what's
yeah,
the next step? And that's part of the reason why I've kind of started talking about it less. I started
yeah,
talking
yeah.
more about true crime, applying the knowledge that I've had.
Mhm.
And I want to expand into other things as well and talking about things that are more fulfilling for me. Because
Yeah.
like that's actually really what it is, right? There came a point where narcissism talking about it was really just the business, and it wasn't as fulfilling for me anymore. Not to say it wasn't helpful for others, but just for me and my spirit, no, it was not as
Yeah.
fulfilling
Yeah. Yeah.
anymore because I was
Yeah.
just going over the same things over and over. I'd prefer to talk more about the spiritual side
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah.
And I will maybe not never talk about narcissistic parents and relationships, but talking more about the stage 2 and stage 3 of healing,
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
where radical self-respect would come in, responsibility would come in,
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
gratitude practice, like looking at that kind of stuff. That has really helped me too.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. Like I think the algorithms do a number on us. Kind of. It's impossible to kind of go out into the world, have like, we as human beings aren't actually meant to have as much feedback and human interaction as creators have once they hit a certain
Yeah,
level, right? That it's actually unnatural, and it's impossible to not be changed by it in some ways,
I'm
right?
noticing that. And
Like,
know what I noticed this? My brother. I tell
yeah,
him like what cause I know, for example, with any opinion, I know the pushback it'll get from all the
yeah,
sides. Like,
yeah,
this people will say this, these people will say that, and I'll tell my brother about it, and now he'll be like, "The hell is going wrong with you, Jared? Like, this is what world are you in where you know all of this pushback, all these people are going to
yeah,
say?"
yeah.
And it makes me realize, yeah, I guess this world is much different. The social media world is much different than the way. I don't know how many people aren't living this way, but I guess there's a fair amount of people that
Yeah.
they're not even really connected to the social media world.
God bless them. They're lucky. I think about how when I started, I was so combative. I was stitching narcissists and talking shit, and I was like, really like in this like offensive defensive posture of like bringing awareness to scapegoating, which meant cutting through a lot of the bullshit. And how much more sensitive to criticism I am now in this weird way, where like I don't want to rock the boat quite as much. I don't want to kind of create conflict with other creators, even though I know that the algorithm loves that bullshit. I want more of like understanding, right? And like less conflict, less anger. I mean, I was so angry when I started. The algorithms love that, of just getting out there and spewing all this anger onto narcissism and talking about how angry I am at my parents, and it, like, maybe it's growth, but it's just really changed a lot of like how I see myself too. It's
Yeah.
it's it's,
I
it's
think it
really.
becomes a big point where you have to make up your mind. Is this going to be a business for you? Or is it something you're just going to do as like a hobby? Because if you
Yeah.
do it as a business, that is going to change a lot of things. I
Yeah.
think it doesn't change much for the better. I'll say
Yeah.
that. I think, and that goes for any of the, not even just this space. I see the business side of any content creator. Almost always it will take away from the authenticity. The
Oh yeah.
only time that isn't true is when someone is already financially independent.
Hmm.
Those people, they have the freedom to truly not need the money so they can
Hmm.
kind of do it as a business, but they're able to be more authentic. But I think almost everyone else, they're forced to lean into some kind of angle, whether it's anger or man hate
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
fill in the blank with some angle, right? I see it everywhere.
Yeah, that's what bothers me about it, is you get your niche and then you're kind of pigeonholed to give the people what they want. I feel that now, where I feel stuck talking about narcissism, where I used to feel confident to just get on and talk about movies, or talk about, I mean, politics, or talk about my day even, or books,
Right.
or, and I feel like, as adult children of narcissists, there's a core belief structure that we have to do away with. That's this core belief that nobody likes us. And so in a lot of ways, the more followers I get, the more people I just believe don't like me.
Ah, interesting.
And it's not entirely that, but there is this like, because I've bounced around and the niche was no niche. Now I feel like, I just I've been at this creative like rut where I just
Yeah.
feel like, with the narcissist stuff, it's like I felt like at one point it was really creative for me. I was mining my own experience. I was coming up with language for it that people were adopting, and now it just feels like recycling in a certain way.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't, I don't know what topic to move on to, but it's like, you know,
Yeah, there's all sorts of topics. There's current
yeah,
events, true
yeah,
crime. I
yeah.
mean, I don't know about you, but I'll get on YouTube and all the platforms and Facebook there's a lot of haters out there. I get all sorts of hate. I get people saying all sorts of nasty things. I don't know
Mhm.
how much of that you get, but you notice that the criticisms, they stand out a lot more a lot of times
Yeah.
than the positive "oh, you do a great job" comments. Like, you'll get a jolt, you get a negative jolt from some of those negative comments, and because some people, they'll even try to act like they know you. I got one
Yeah.
person saying the other day, saying like, "Oh, I knew Jared in high school. He was a bully and a horrible person." I'm like, what? Like, I don't even know who this person
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
but they're just
Yeah.
making shit up to try to
Yeah.
like throw shit at
Yeah.
the wall.
Yeah.
And it's just like, after a while, that stuff can wear on you after a while.
I think that's contributed to like this more sheepishness that I have now, is that like I am kind of sensitive, and like there was a lot of, like when I went at Lee Hammock, like
I remember, yeah.
I wouldn't do that anymore, but it created all this backlash of his flying monkeys coming at me, getting counts disabled, and like I did it. It was me that, it was me that kind of went at him. But I just don't have it right now to like want that conflict. Like the conflict almost like hurts my soul, kind of, where it's like now when I get like, because I get a lot of like cut your hair, or like, like, oh, your message would be better if you cut your hair. And it's like, okay, like, what does that
What is this,
matter?
the 60s?
And I like to go at those comments to release some steam, but then you get the people saying, "Oh, just ignore it." It's like, you try to fucking get like 200 comments like this a day. Like I gotta like
Yeah.
address some of it because I'm absorbing it. So I gotta
Yeah.
like push back a little bit. But like,
Yeah,
yeah,
pick and choose your battles, is what I would say.
yeah, yeah. I don't get a whole lot of negative stuff too much anymore. I've had a couple like estranged parents starting shit, but like, I don't talk politics nearly as much, so I'm not attracting that. I mean, that when I was doing more politics on TikTok, there was a lot of like, ugly stuff, death threats, like getting put on a Fox News segment, and taken out of context, to say something I didn't really say.
No, I get you. Now, I guess we should talk about this too, the software narcissist. I know
Mhm.
we both have some agreement about this, that I think
Mhm.
there's things to learn. They're not wrong about everything they say, but I think the people that think they're the end all be all, they're going to give us the glimpse inside their mind, the sneak peek, the real deal, they know it. I think those people are misguided. It's like you always have to be asking yourself, well, how is their narcissistic operating system influencing what they say?
So yeah, a couple things about that. I do think there are some that are adding to the conversation. I think there are some that are just regurgitating a bunch of shit they heard online and waving around a diagnosis, the most popular one specifically. I think there's value in watching what they're saying versus what they're doing. Again, the most popular one saying like, I haven't changed, and yet he's basically like a coach for victims. If you're a narcissist who hasn't changed, you shouldn't be talking to victims. And they'll get stuff in his comments like, well, you've changed, look at you. And no, I haven't changed. And so they're having to really disingenuously thread this needle between like them remaining a narcissist and them also being capable of helping like victims. I think it replicates systems of narcissistic abuse with them, where you get supposed victims in their comment section siding and enabling the abuser, the narcissist, at the expense of other victims, right? If you don't kind of fall for their bullshit, and push back on some of what they're saying, they will abuse. They will gaslight. They will make up stories about you and then leverage their huge followings to harass and weaponize them. But I also think, some of them, I think are adding. Sam Vaknin, I think undoubtedly has added to the conversation in ways that, whether you kind of believe his angle at it, I tend to like some of the stuff he talks about. I think he's a little different than someone, say, like Lee Hammock, but he's still at the end of the day of a narcissist. And so
Right.
it's like, like you said, like the people that think the narcissist perspective is going to illuminate something don't understand that the narcissist perspective is precisely where the problem is.
Yeah.
And so, like with Lee, how I went at him was I got really offended, actually. Like people kept asking me, "What do you think of this guy?" And I would say, like, I don't want to watch him. If somebody tells me they're a narcissist, guess what? I don't want them in my life. Isn't this the whole fucking point, is to avoid narcissists? But anyway, so I finally watched a video and he was laughing on this podcast with two cute girls, laughing about, the whole tone is wrong, number one, but laughing about emotional regulation. And he said, I can't regulate my emotions, so I try to regulate yours. And I thought, if I had never heard that term before, I might think that's an insight into the narcissist perspective. But since I have, I know that that's literally verbatim the definition of emotional regulation. So I said, you know what, I'm going to stitch him with some anger and see if he understands how he emotionally regulates, see what he does with some anger. Now, I know this is the internet and I know that he owes me nothing and that this was me starting shit. But what he did was within 5 minutes, stitch the video, go, oh, this guy's weird. He must have a girlfriend who broke up with him because of me. As in saying, he's the narcissist, ladies, go do your thing. And then I got harassed for 6 months, right? And again, like, what he did was emotionally regulate me. What he didn't do was understand. Maybe he didn't care, but like, to me, it was like he exposed himself in front of all these people of lying and gaslighting, because I don't actually have a girlfriend who broke up with me because of him. I don't give a single fuck about him other than he's an abuser in a healing space. And I would think we should be testing these people, because if they're going to be in healing spaces, there should be a zero tolerance policy for abusing. It's not good enough to say, well, he helped this person over here, therefore he gets to abuse this person over there. And so to me, like him specifically, the vibe is all wrong. This whole, I'm your favorite narcissist, this whole kind of smiley, cuddly narcissist. And then you see him on the Narcissist Playbook going, I'm really sad all the time. Really? I haven't seen a lot of your videos, but that's not what you're showing your audience. And then you start to think he's love bombing his audience.
Yes.
What he is a surrogate narcissist telling all of these people exactly what they wanted their narcissist to hear, to tell them, when it's not actually the truth of narcissism, right? He's selling them closure, right? He's a surrogate narcissist, but it's actually dangerous. And it's not making him any better. It's making him a lot of money.
Yes.
But like, a narcissist doesn't get better by overdosing on supply. They'll say, oh, well, he says he's getting supply. It's like a heroin addict doesn't get better by moving into a poppy field and staying high all the time, right? And so again, it's like, I'm sorry, I have a special like dislike for him, because again, it's like, I think then he would come on my page and make comments saying I'm obsessed with him. I'm not obsessed with you, bro. You made a video to over 1 million people calling me a narcissist, who have now been coming on my page for 6 months talking shit. And because they're coming on my page talking about you, I have to respond. I wish I never heard of you, right? But it's like, it splits the community. What do you think of this guy? And if I don't say I think he's great, then the flying monkeys can, you know.
And I think the flying monkeys, to me, they're just as bad as the narcissists themselves. I don't like them.
They were creating fake accounts of me on TikTok using pictures of my 5-year-old fucking nephew that they found online. This is what narcissists do. And so again, it's like, if you think like they're like vampires, you don't invite them into your community, right? And so this whole thing where it's like, he got tagged so many times on my account, I finally had to address it. And then all of a sudden I've got this narcissist to contend with, that it just doesn't make sense in healing spaces. But then people will say, well, he helped me. Okay, he helped you. That's how every narcissist gets by. That not everybody sees it's literally just replicating a system of narcissistic abuse on a social media level scale. And then you have mental health care professionals, you know, co-signing it. And again, it's like, I always say, you look at what they're saying and you look at what they're doing and you see how they're not lining up. He says he's not a narcissistic abuse recovery coach. He's selling his services, right? He says he's not healed, but what he's demonstrating, what he's modeling is a healed narcissist. Right. I mean, regardless of what he's saying. I'm so sorry. With him, like, I just, you know, it's really frustrating.
Well, I stress to people, there's nothing that you're going to learn from them that you couldn't also learn from someone else that's not a narcissist. They're not going to give you, there's nothing special. And I get it, Sam Vaknin might be an exception to some people, but even then, none of them are an exception to me when it comes to the narcissistic operating system. No, none of them are above that. Right. And then people would say about Sam, he might even be worse than that. He could be a psychopath. There's another documentary about him, I, Psychopath, which I don't know if you've seen that, but I buy it. I think that could be true of him. So no, none of them are the exception.
right.
None of them are telling you things that you couldn't learn from somebody else. And then even in the Narcissist Playbook, you see all of them in there. Lee, Sam,
Mhm,
they lean into the victim narrative, or
mhm.
oh, I feel so superior, but actually I hate myself. I cry myself to sleep. It's like, is that really what's going on there, or is that just what you want us to believe is going on there,
Right,
and
right.
that's just you leaning into the victimhood? I know which one I think it is. I think it's this impression management. They all seem to do that to control the image, to
Mhm.
control the narrative of how people see narcissists. And then the big thing they'll all say is, I hate the term narcissistic abuse. Why isn't there borderline abuse? Why isn't there psychopathic abuse? It's like, well, dude, like just the fact that you're even upset about this
Yeah.
means you're going
But
about it the wrong way anyway. It's like,
you,
if you really wanted to help the image of narcissism, what you would do is work on yourself and
right.
stop acting in the ways the narcissist would. That's the best way to help the stigma.
Right, right. I mean, you mentioned it, this swing from grandiosity to victimhood. You see that in them depending on what
Yeah.
sort of feedback they're getting, right? And so, I guess to me, like, I want everybody to get better. Like, I want everybody to do what's best for them. I just like, I think the persona we see on the screen is it becomes a grandiose false
Yep.
self, like mental healness. What the fuck does that mean? You're a narcissist. You're mentally healing people. I'm sorry, like that doesn't make sense, right? But you're also not healed or changed.
Yeah. But
It's
good
this.
luck telling people that, because
Oh yeah, I
they'll
know
be
people.
very defensive. They'll
I
say,
know.
nope.
He
See,
helped me.
that's exactly what they'll say.
He helped me. Okay, but how many people does somebody get to help in order to abuse other people? Right? Like again, it wasn't just me that he did this to. I can take what he did to me because I invited that. I was testing him, and like I don't even consider what he did to be like abusive towards me. I just consider it to be illuminating that he's still just an unhealed narcissist, like flailing around out here that's managed to kind of put on
Yeah.
a nice enough face. I mean, he used to begin his early videos, your favorite narcissist. What? Your favorite abuser? That's disgusting.
Yeah. I mean, they've all fallen trap to they're going to give us special knowledge because
Yeah,
they have the disorder.
yeah.
It reminds me of something I used to hear in the dating spaces. They would say, if you want to learn how to catch a fish, ask the fisherman, not the fish. I would say kind of similarly, except opposite. If you want to learn how to recover from a narcissist, don't act a narcissist. Act the people who have actually recovered, and actually the people that have been the victims of them.
Narcissism creates an inverted reality. On that, I think we can all agree, right? And so part of that inversion is in normal like situations, we would think to learn about something, you'd go to the person experiencing that. It's inverted with a narcissist. A narcissist, we learn about them from watching and listening and seeing what they're not doing. But also, like, how would they heal? Would they heal? They would heal by sitting their family in a room and listening to the ways they've hurt people and tolerating criticism and tolerating accurate descriptions of their lives and their behavior without melting down, gaslighting, doing the things that they all do. And so when you put them in these echo chambers, it's actually making them worse, right? It is actually feeding their grandiosity, feeding their narcissism on levels that are really unhealthy. I mean, when I watch Lee, it's like people talk about the narcissistic smirk. Just go, when he says in the playbook, he's sad all the time, then what is this constant smirking in all of his videos? It's that
Yeah.
he knows he's pulling one over on people.
Yep.
I mean,
And laugh to the bank, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's the
good for
business,
him. Like, honestly, like
narcissistic supply. That's what for
it's a
Sam,
good
Lee,
gig
all
if
of
you
them.
can get it. I mean, it's like convincing people like to not trust narcissists while trusting you, the narcissist, is some mumbo jumbo feat. I also think like people end up trading my narcissist for those narcissists, and they're still dealing. They're still like praying at the temple of narcissism,
Yeah.
basically, right? Where it and don't get me started on that my narcissist stuff. We shouldn't refer to them as my narcissist. It's
Yeah.
claiming ownership over the thing we're trying to get rid of. Like
No, I agree with that. I think, there's many stages of healing for people, right? And I know, like, I've been catching myself, like, being a little less tolerant sometimes of the people that are still in the early stages when I shouldn't be. It's like, no, I was there too, right? I was the one that was obsessed with the content. I was the one that was like hooked on it, but it just takes time, right? It takes time to go through that, etc. Now, I would say this too. If someone's still there 5, 10 years later without any improvements, then that's a problem too to
yeah,
me. It's like,
yeah,
okay,
yeah,
there comes a point where you got to get to the next step.
yeah. Yeah, you got to make it about like growing and healing, and not just kind of knowing about the narcissist.
Yeah. And honestly, I think that's where the estranged parents come into play. I've tried to invite some of them on my show, to which, they wanted questions in advance. I gave them questions in advance. And then
Wow.
they would say, no, I'm uncomfortable with your questions. And we want to go over them all. And I was like, no, no, no. If we're going to talk, we're going to have a genuine conversation. We're not going to have pre-scripted questions. But what I would have said to them is, what you guys need, a lot of them, is what I learned and you learned in AA and NA, just like the responsibility and what
Right.
true amends looks like. And that's another thing I think NA and AA got right is okay, people with addictions hurt people. They
Hmm.
did. And
Yeah.
they would say, okay, make a list of people you have harmed, became willing to make amends to them all, except when to do so would injure them or others. Okay, good. And then they would say, what you do is, of course, actions, change behavior is the best
Hmm.
amends. But when you say you're sorry and apologize to them, you leave the result up to the
Yeah.
universe or whatever your higher power is. That's true
Yeah.
humility
Yeah.
in that situation.
I,
It's
I,
not becoming an estranged parent content creator talking about how actually these kids go in no contact. They're really the problem. They're just avoiding difficult conversations. We're in a trend of people going no contact. And it's like, is that what it is? That's an interesting
it's
framing.
so wild. They can't help but tell on themselves, like their
Yeah.
tones. Like I'm sure there are some people in those communities that are legitimately aggrieved, but like the ones making content, like it takes 2 minutes to listen to them and go, oh, well, you're just showing us why this was the last option. I mean, the idea that family estrangement is like a TikTok trend belittles the idea that like going estranged from your family is one of the most painful decisions anybody has to make, regardless of the details of the abuse or whatever it is. You are choosing to do something that is against our biological need for family, right? And the idea, I'm sure there are some people that are just, oh, I just saw a TikTok, you know what, fuck my family. But the vast majority of people, everybody I've talked to, it's a last resort, and it's like it's because of the way, when we talk about it like being in a cult, it's like when we deprogram ourselves, if we go back into the cult, we subconsciously flip back into the role or the thinking of the cult, and it's really dangerous for us. And so the
Yes.
no contact, it's funny they say they're avoiding tough conversations. It's all just projection, obviously. Like we've all wanted to talk to our parents about our traumas, to talk to our parents about the reality of our lives, and it's their inability to kind of see us in any other way than they're choosing to see us. It's really, it's both validating in a certain way because it's like, look at these weirdos, but it's also really infuriating that like, because I see it a lot now, like this idea that like we've turned everything into trauma and everybody's abandoning their family because of a TikTok trend, or we've just expanded our understanding of psychological trauma. We live in a world that's traumatizing us, and also these parents can't take responsibility. It's crazy.
And
It's
I would
crazy.
say to other estranged parents, right? Okay, maybe a child of yours went no contact with you. I would highly recommend you listen to people that have gotten the result that you want, not
Hmm.
someone that's still estranged from the kids. Like
Yeah,
you want
yeah.
listen to somebody that has actually gotten a good result. So an estranged parent that maybe did reconcile. And I know in that Oprah documentary about it a year or so ago, or however long ago it was, there were some estranged parents in there that they did reconcile.
Hmm.
And listening to them, and you notice what I heard in them was more humility, more
Hmm.
accountability, more self reflection, thinking about how their actions and words are influencing their children. The things that you don't hear in
Yeah,
the estranged parents that are
right,
still
right.
estranged.
It's all black and white too. Like they're not. I can make space for the fact that there are obviously valid situations where the estranged parent is aggrieved.
Yeah.
Like narcissists have parents too. Bad people have,
Yeah.
but like, but for them, it's just this either or thing. And the tone, again, it's the tone. It's this like punitive tone. I saw one today of like, oh, they think they're getting their inheritance. Well, they're shit out of luck, and it's like, okay,
I
cool.
mean, they think they're the victim of no contact, right? They think
Yeah,
that's a
yeah,
punishment. And it's like,
yeah.
well, If it was an adult narcissistic child, because like you said, all narcissists have had parents. Yeah, I mean, is it a silent treatment? Are they punishing you to manipulate and control you? That's different. But I fully acknowledge there can also be situations where it's a narcissistic parent and an adult narcissistic child, right? And
Yeah,
they're like narc battling
yeah,
back and
yeah.
forth. Who's in the
Yeah.
right? Who's in the wrong?
I
It's hard to
reconciled
say.
with my mother. Like, I don't consider my mother a narcissist, but she has a lot of emotional instability. And like, I had to go no contact for a while because I was working through the trauma. And there was an incident where she beat me for wetting the bed when I was 7 after my dad left. And like, how I needed to work through that incident with her because it was so affecting. Like, think of this 7-year-old kid, what's his bed, looking for comfort, and gets beaten and sent back to, and she would frame it as like, I'm not going to listen to you call me a bad mother. And I'm saying, like, that shattered my sense of safety. Dad had already shattered it by leaving. What you did, it wasn't about the physical abuse itself, it was about the context. And she just couldn't make space for me. And then we went on to blame me for everything because these things happened and they really kind of fucked me up. But eventually, I reestablished contact, and we've talked. It was a needed break because, like, I couldn't listen to her. She'd say I did the best I could, and I'd say, Mom, I don't think beating a 7-year-old child for wetting the bed is actually the best you could have done, and I actually find it offensive that you're framing it that way. Would you say that? I mean, if you saw that in a movie, would you say that's the best? That I needed a hug and a change of clothes,
Right.
right? And to be made safe. And I don't think you understand the significance of how earth shattering that moment was, because I don't remember any of my childhood, but I remember that, and
Right.
it was really difficult. Um, but I didn't want to be estranged. That's the thing. If it were just trend, I wanted to be understood and to have this kind of scapegoat energy released, that like these things fucking happened and these were affecting of me in my life from my perspective. And the fact that nobody in my family system has made space for the reality that this is trauma and instead has sought to kind of blame me for everything that's gone wrong in my life. It's a search for truth, not estrangement. And if we can't live in the truth when there's things like that, it can be difficult to be in a relationship.
They just really struggle to sit with those uncomfortable feelings or
Yeah,
uncomfortable perspectives, right?
yeah,
They just repulse it. They repel it back. No, I'm not going to listen to you saying I was a bad mother, right? Something like that. They
yeah,
just that's
yeah,
where the lack of emotional safety comes in
yeah,
because there's no validation of your perspective. Now, granted,
yeah,
you've improved that relationship, so that's something to note too, right?
yeah.
So
It's
depending
still a
on how,
challenge, but it's like I kind of looked at it like I'm estranged from my dad. I don't talk to my sister, and
right,
my mother. Part of what helped me was my coaching practice of working with a lot of women who were married to men like my dad, and recognizing that my mother was incredibly abusive. That wasn't the only. I mean, it was just a nightmare, but also that, like, she was dealing with a very difficult situation with my father. I think one of the mistakes she made was like seeing herself as the primary victim of my dad instead of understanding us kids are being victimized on both ends, and that, like, the problem isn't actually that my dad's not parenting, he's a psychopath, he's not going to. It's that we don't have a single safe person. Right? That, like, you're
that's
not
interesting.
you're not safe either, because look at you beating me for wetting the bed, right? Like,
Right.
that's not safe. Like, so what does that do to me? It means, like, I can't express my emotions. I can't ask for help. I mean, I told her, like, it wasn't about the physicality of it. I could take physical abuse, if I did something wrong. Like, I don't think it'd be that damaging. But the context, and what was I being beaten for? Having trauma, right?
Right.
And then she would say, "Well, you went to bed till 7th grade because you're tall." I like that. What does that even mean? Like, it was about trauma, and so she now understands. But
It was
you know,
interesting. She was trying to be competitive about who was the biggest victim of your dad. Almost, it sounds like.
well, I don't think she saw us, like, she didn't understand. I mean, she didn't understand him. She came from a real conservative Catholic family, where she was kind of raised to be a wife, and I don't think divorce was in her vocabulary. And so when my dad kind of like chewed her up and spit her out and left her on her own and played hardball with child support, the marriage disintegrated like right before my dad started making a lot of money. And so she had a lot of resentments, right? And so she couldn't see that. But then like she went from my dad, who's this new age yoga weirdo who owns new age record labels, to a banker. And what did that mean for me as a kid? Like having to kind of like I was raised a vegetarian till I went to kindergarten. Then I was like, why can't I have a hot dog? Like it's weird. Like I feel weird. Like, all these. But then by the time I'm 13, force feeding me steak to put weight on me for basketball, and being married to this banker, right? And where it's like it
Quite the
created
dichotomy. Quite the dichotomy.
yeah, and I mean, I realized she married her second husband, because he was nothing like my dad. But like going from this yoga kid, my dad was a follower of, this is a whole nother topic, but my dad was a follower of this guy, Swami Rama, who was kind of a famous guru in the 70s, who was called a psychopath, who had to leave the country because of real allegations of sexual misconduct. My dad remains devoted to him, even though he's dead. And so growing up, nobody knew what the fuck yoga was in Wisconsin in 1984. And so I had this very strange dad who, like, most kids in Wisconsin grow up watching their dad drink beer and watch the Packers on
Yeah,
Sundays. My dad, I watched, was happiest meditating in a room doing yoga, and so like it was just too much for a kid to make sense of, than a banker. And I love my stepdad, but it was like, how do I make sense of all of this? Who am I? Like spiritually too. Like, so my dad's basically like a Hindu and into this hatha yoga stuff. And then my mother sends me to Catholic school. But my first spiritual understanding comes through the yoga stuff. And so then I'm sitting in religion class in Catholic school, like not being able to like ask questions about the two, right? Then she made me, like, she forced me to be confirmed. I'm a confirmed Catholic.
yeah,
but like it was all so confusing,
yeah.
it was all very confusing.
Yeah, I would never have thought that. Besides the fact that I knew you had done some of that, I never would have thought
Yeah,
that you
yeah.
confirmed Catholic.
I've actually come to love all of that, because it has made me, I think, a lot of like, I still struggle with why people like listening to me on narcissism, or what it means to like have all these followers. But I think part of it is rooted in this kind of like, I grew up in a new age bookstore, right? Literally, my dad owned a new age bookstore. I learned to walk in a new age bookstore and Eastern spirituality, and then sent to Catholic school. And so like then as I had mental health problems, my dad would talk more about like the conditioned mind and take it a more Eastern approach. My mom was all about whatever the latest psychology fad was. You need Prozac, or, and in those two experiences, there's a way to kind of synthesize them and see things like with narcissism, instead of seeing it through the lens of the DSM and disorder and illness, seeing it through the lens of human consciousness, right? Seeing it through the lens of something different, than just reading about it in the DSM and regurgitating, like theories on it.
No, I mean,
Who
that makes
knows?
perfect sense to me. Now, one thing I want to ask you about before we close here, you mentioned New Age Bookstore. I think this is something I want to start doing. But what is a book that you recommend the audience reads that maybe it could be anything, a life changing book or just a book that you really enjoyed?
That's interesting, because I love books. You know, I'll name like a fantasy series that I really enjoyed as I was early on in my trauma recovery. There's a trilogy called the Broken Earth trilogy, written by a Black woman named N.K. Jemisin, and it's set off in the way distant future. And there are these children who are called orogenes, and their emotions create earthquakes, right? And it's a post-civilization. But the subtext is trauma, racism, ostracization, and it's just this really brilliant story, or three parts. It's the only sci-fi trilogy where every book won like the Nebula Award, whatever the big sci-fi award is. And so it's really well regarded. It's called the Broken Earth trilogy. The first book is called The Fifth Season. And again, in our talking about like reading fiction, it just really speaks to so many different layers of trauma. I mean, it would work for African Americans and racism. It works for scapegoat children because you can imagine. So these children's emotions create like seismic events, and so they're rounded up and turned into weapons, or they're killed, or and it really kind of spoke to a lot of what I was going through in uncovering the scapegoating children. As far as like more of the self-help books, I really think, and I'm just listening to it now, this CPTS, people have always told me about Pete Walker. I read the Tao of Fully Feeling, but this CPTSD from surviving to thriving has been actually really excellent, in that it's not just an exploration of like what's happening, but kind of real, not solutions, but ways to manage and live with it and understand it. I think it's really good.
Right on. And where else can people find more of you?
I'm on Instagram. The Instagram posts to TikTok, to Facebook, to YouTube, although I've been meaning to kind of cultivate YouTube a little bit more. For some reason, it's like intimidating to me. I don't know why. Like, I feel like I need better like production value and longer form content to swim in that pool.
Well,
Um,
you know what they say? They say do it first. Like
yeah,
don't wait until that. Like do it and then
yeah,
evolve into that.
yeah,
Because there is something to be said about production value. I think the YouTube algorithm does reward it more,
yeah.
but I think it's better just to start and
When I
then
think of you,
improve.
yeah, when I think of YouTube, like I want, like I almost, it makes me want like a partner, like to do
Yeah.
something more like this. Like I have a friend, Shadow DeAngelis.
Oh
I
yeah, I
forget.
haven't seen him around by the way.
Yeah, he's been kind of, but we're friends offline, so we talk, every month or so. And I think he's been kind of busy with his life, and like you and I have been talking. I think we hit a kind of wall, all of us, in talking about narcissism, and that like there has to be a break. Kind of like I kind of think it may have re-traumatized me a little bit of just keeping me in this mindset of trying to mine my own experience to make content. Um, it sometimes feels like it's keeping us stuck. So I think he's been on. I've been seeing him more on Facebook. So I don't like.
Interesting. Okay, because I haven't
Um,
seen him anywhere now that I think of
yeah,
it,
yeah.
TikTok or Facebook. I used to see him more on
He's a great
TikTok.
guy. Yeah, yeah. Like we've been really supportive to each other. I honestly, this is kind of a weird idea, but have thought of having like a little support group for creators where we like meet up on Discord or something, because
Good.
it's a unique experience that's kind of new in human history of having this much interaction, and how it affects us, because it really does affect us, and just having a kind of like little forum for us to talk, especially guys. I think I'm always about men having group meetings where we can kind of be vulnerable a little bit more, and I've been thinking more and more about doing something like that as I've felt more and more isolated in my own shit,
I think that'd be a great idea, actually. I think a
yeah,
lot of people would like that. And
yeah,
I also think the down periods, I'm noticing for me as well, they're very important.
yeah.
Because it's really hard, I think, to constantly be making content and then also be growing, also, like through, like,
it, it
it becomes difficult, I think.
I think it hijacks our own process a little bit, right?
I could see, yes, that's a good way to
Like
put it.
like it's like putting everything out, but then like we stop kind of focusing on our own healing. I
Yeah.
know that's been hard for me because the early content was about just sharing this process that had really helped me, and watching my growth as kind of like not like inspirational, but as like something for people to engage with in their own process. And then it becomes just like, oh, you're an educator or you're a creator or what, something very different than what I had
Yeah.
intended.
Well, it's like the space away from narcissistic parents. Like that space is
Mhm.
so key for the healing. And I
Yeah.
think it's similar with the content where if I'm just constantly talking about three steps to this or talking about the narcissist dynamics, it's kind of hard to get to the next level, I think. And I also think there comes a point where sometimes it's time to move on. Like it's
Yeah.
time to like put it away and say,
Yeah.
I talked about it. My friend Meredith Miller, that's pretty much what she did, right? She talked about it for a while. She had some great insights. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of her, but look her up on YouTube. Her channel's
Oh,
Inner Integration. You would probably really like it. She
I
talks
will.
about narcissistic family cults, again, I've got a lot of good insights from her. I've spoken to her on the channel here too.
Yeah,
But she
yeah,
moved forward, is the bottom line.
yeah,
She moved
yeah.
forward because it just wasn't right for her spirit anymore. And I've seen other people do that too. But the difference was some of the other ones that did it, they couldn't do it without belittling and bad talking the narcissism space. They're like, oh, these
Yeah.
idiots, they
Yeah.
couldn't. So I don't recommend doing that. But
Well, for me, it's created this really weird thing where, like, when I started, I was in a very specific place of healing and a very specific place of just like this open book. I was doing a lot of psychedelics and like channeling my consciousness, right? And because it felt so good and I got so much attention in that version of me, then the accounts got banned. And each time they get banned, it's a little different each time, and like I have this weird like judgment of who I am now and trying to get back to this place that I was actually trying to leave. And I kind of look at it, and it's because of the social media aspect, right? Like, and so I think like being free to say like I have talked this to death, right? Like I've said all I need to say is empowering. I mean, for me, I worry about finances because this is how I make money now, and so it's like it's wrapped up in that. But like, um, the goal is growth and transformation, and like for me it's been so intertwined with who I am. Like it's not like I've never written anything, it's never been like a posture or a kind of like, it's always just been me kind of sharing authentically. I have to recognize that we change as people, and to share authentically is to be a different person at different times in our lives. That like we're growing. I couldn't have stayed in that position of open trauma. Like I couldn't stay there, right? Like
yeah, it's not meant to be a permanent place.
no,
Like
no.
being a victim anyway. It's like
But
supposed to
I
be a
like look
step.
back on it with this weird nostalgia, with this like, oh, that version of you. Like I had kind of detached from like wanting money. I was like proud of like being away from culture and kind of poor and like away from the rat race. It was also like post 2020, so 2021, 2022, where I think with the COVID experience, like there was this weird pocket of time where I think we all kind of saw a possibility for a future that never occurred, that things might change in a way that moves us away from consumerism and capitalism and productivity and all of these things. And then it went a totally different direction. But there was something, I don't know, there was something about that version of me that I look back on with real kind of nostalgic, like clinging, which isn't healthy,
Hmm.
like,
I guess it'd be interesting to figure out why.
yeah.
Like, is it more of the attention that you were getting, or the version of yourself that you were that was you felt just like an authentic version, or what?
You want to know, part of it is I feel a lot of fear now. Like I got COVID in
Ah,
2023, and I think it did something to my amygdala because I emerged with this body somatic feeling of fear that's been with me for 3 years now. And at that point in time prior, I had felt fearless. I had felt like I had kind of tamed my nervous system and that I had done the things I needed to do. And I don't know if other people had this experience with COVID, but it did something to my physiology that's never actually snapped back into place.
well, I can see why that would not be a good thing. I wouldn't like that feeling at all.
No, it's
And of
not
course,
good.
if you look back at a time, a version of yourself that was fearless,
Yeah.
and if you have a version of fear now, then yeah, of course, that's going to be nostalgic.
Part of me wonders though, like I was trying to get into my body. And was that period of fearlessness like the calm before the storm, where there was like dopamine overdoses through social media attention? There was this like new recovery stuff. And is this fear COVID related, or is it me actually getting into my feelings in my body? And what's there is actually fear, right? That I was a scared child that was
Yeah,
repressed, so it's
it's
who fucking
interesting.
knows?
It's interesting to examine, and
Yeah.
then interesting to think about what the way forward is.
Yeah.
Like is what the fear exactly is. Like, what
Yeah,
is the fear
exactly.
now?
Exactly. Exactly. I think the fear now is just the world's crumbling.
That's and that's a very
Like
real
it's
thing.
like existential fear of like what like what's it going to look like in 5 years? What's it going to look like in 10 years? How am I going to make a living? Like what all this stuff.
And I think that's something we should probably talk about next time, the
Oh, yeah,
current
yeah,
events and just that kind of thing, because it stuff is important. and I'm
Yeah,
passionate
yeah,
about it like you are too. So
yeah, yeah.
I think there's a very important discussion to be had there.
Anytime. I love it.
All right, Christian. So always a
All right,
pleasure
brother.
talking to you, my man. We
Good
always have a
talking.
great time.